Well, ladies and gentlemen, friends, guests, welcome to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate this afternoon as we gather on these traditional lands of the Algonquin people for a discussion of such incredible generational importance. My name is Khalil Sharif. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Aga Khan Foundation Canada, and I'm delighted to be here partnering with the Alliance for Human Development for this event and grateful for the support of Global Affairs Canada. Some of you are new faces to this building. Since this building opened in 2008, it was opened by His Highness the Aga Khan and the Prime Minister. We have sought to host here those conversations that might lift our collective horizons for the kind of leadership role that Canada might play in the world. It is a conversation perhaps no more important today than it has been for a long time. This afternoon, we are launching a groundbreaking series published by The Lancet entitled Advancing Early Childhood Development from Science to Scale, that brings together the latest research, not only in the neurobiology of development, but also on the policy environment and the intervention packages required to make real advances for children globally. Now, the message of this series is clear. It is, at least it's clear to me. Given the lifelong and even generational consequences of the first years of life, not heeding the call to invest appropriately in early childhood development effectively relegates generations of vulnerable populations to marginalization. So we are at AKFC terribly excited to be hosting this forum today for three reasons. First of all, it is an excellent opportunity to elaborate and invest in the crosswalks between serious research and evidence and policy and programming. We have today some of the leading global authorities on the subject, including members of the steering committee that oversaw the development of the series that was published in The Lancet, along with people involved at the kind of cold face at the front line of delivery and policy making associated with these issues, both in Canada and around the world. The second reason we're so excited is that Canada itself, as we all know, is in the midst of a reflection on its future international policy and international assistance policy, and this is a great moment to be continuing to inform the direction and development of that policy. And finally, ECD has been a major area of priority for the Aga Khan Development Network institutions for decades. Canada has been a longstanding partner of ours in programming in ECD in many parts of the world, from frontline grassroots programming to advanced scholarship and intellectual inquiry. AKDN considers ECD a global priority in every geography where it has a presence. We have a new collaboration with IDRC and the Alliance for Human Development, which we're very excited about. And I'm delighted to have with us two colleagues from the Aga Khan University here with us today, Dr. Zulfi Bhutta, who you'll meet in just a few moments, and Kofi Marfo, who is the inaugural head of the Aga Khan University's Institute for Human Development in Nairobi. And I'm told that he will be here any moment once Air Canada's fleet gets its house in order. So it's a delight to have you all here. Great to see so much interest in this issue. You have on your seats the executive summary of the Lancet series, an agenda for today, and the bios of the people who will be presenting. So I won't belabor all those bios for you today. I want to recognize the presence of UNICEF here, who have been extraordinarily supportive, of course, of the Lancet series and then of us doing this launch here in Ottawa. And to bring greetings right at the beginning from UNICEF headquarters, I want to welcome Ted Shaban, Director of Programs for UNICEF. Again, Ted's bios is in your packages, and lovely to have Ted with us here in Ottawa. Ted.
Thank you, Khalil, and good afternoon. I'd really like to thank the Aga Khan Foundation Canada and the Alliance for Human Development for the invitation to UNICEF to this important event, and really congratulate them on the Canadian launch of the ECD Lancet Special Series. Our Executive Director, Tony Lake, would have liked to be here, and he extends his appreciation and best wishes this afternoon. Why are we focused on ECD? Drawing on the brain science and all the great evidence that is published in the Lancet, of which you have the executive summary. We now know that in the earliest years of life, children's brain form 1,000 neural connections every second. Connections that are the building block of a child's future. But those connections can be interrupted if a child is poorly nourished or nurtured, if she isn't properly stimulated, if she isn't protected from violence. A child whose brain does not develop properly may not learn as well or earn as much, which translates into a diminished future for her, but also less sustainable goal for society. And that's why UNICEF focuses so much of its attention, its advocacy, its resources, its programming to address that critical period of life. UNICEF's approach to ECD is holistic in that it brings together health and nutrition, and stimulation and learning, and protection from violence. And we need to bring these issues together. It's not just a question of focusing on child survival or on early education or on parenting or on freedom from violence. It's really a question of bringing all these things together to support the child. And what's important is not just that we have the knowledge in terms of the science. What's also important is that we have the knowledge in terms of what works and what can make a difference. And I'd like to give a few examples. I'd like to start at the policy level where UNICEF has worked with a number of countries where it supports operations in supporting the development of national ECD policies. And I'd like to give the example specifically from Uganda, where last year the national government put together a policy working with its partners which articulated a holistic approach to supporting ECD through health, education, and social protection, and which brought government, civil society, the private sector, international partners, and families around basic ECD intervention packages that can make the biggest difference for the child in her first 2,000 days. So from conception through 5 to 6 years of age, basically. At the program level, UNICEF is working through existing delivery platforms in over 20 countries to work with frontline workers, community health workers, for example, to include elements of simulation in health interventions. So in Belize, we've worked with the health system and local governance bodies to strengthen the training of these health workers and incorporate the package Care for Child Development, which was developed jointly with WHO, and really tries to integrate elements of simulation, elements of dialogue with parents into the health approach, into the health program. So as we're reaching and working with parents and communities in terms of immunization, in terms of other health intervention, there's a dialogue about simulation, there's an interaction about parenting, and the kind of support not only that the child needs, but also that the parents need as we move forward. We've also focused, and I think it's very important, to address the issue of data and measurement of child development outcomes at the population level. And this is a work still in progress. There is a survey that many countries undertake called the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, which is one of the major sources of information in terms of how countries are progressing in their development in addition to administrative data. And what we've done is we worked on an index called the Early Childhood Development Index, which tries to measure children's cognitive, language, social, and emotional development at 60 months of age, and use that as a measure for how that country is doing in terms of ECD. And that index today is in use in over 50 countries. And we've also worked, and I think this is part of what we're trying to do here today, on communicating the science of ECD to a wide range of audiences. There's a communication campaign called #EarlyMomentsMatter, which I recommend you take a look at, which aims to increase understanding of the importance of nutrition, stimulation, love, and protection in the earliest years of life, and really tries to communicate that in ways that are easily understood and easily translatable. And lastly, we've worked to try to strengthen partnerships around ECD. None of this can be done without partnerships. Today is an example of partnership. It's a partnership with communities and families, partnership with countries, but also internationally, how to put together an architecture that can move forward on the ECD agenda. So UNICEF working with the World Bank, Hilton Foundation, the Alliance for Human Development, Aga Khan, and many others, is working to put together a network called the ECD Action Network to help accelerate programming in countries to help achieve the young child SDG targets. I mentioned the SDGs, and I think at this point in time, I think what's particularly exciting is not just the realization that coming together around that early childhood period of life can make a real difference, but really that agenda is also couched in the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. I think for the first time, there's a recognition of the importance of working on early childhood development in order to achieve sustainable development under the Agenda 2030, with targets around education, nutrition, health, prevention of violence. And I just, while I'm speaking to this, want to say that the examples I've given, largely by virtue of where UNICEF spends most of its attention and resources, have largely been from low-income and middle-income countries. But this is truly a universal agenda. It's an agenda that's equally valid in Canada, as it is in the United States, as it is in Kenya, as it is in South Sudan, as it is in South Africa. And the reason is because while we are, of course, concerned about early childhood in countries that are still in the process of moving from low income to middle income to upper income, it is equally true that children living in disadvantaged households in high income countries are also at risk and need that support as well. So I think what I've been able to show in those few words is that there's been significant progress made, and I think a huge opportunity right now to partner around the issue of early childhood development, but there's also still a lot of work to be done. There's still some significant gaps. The Lancet papers that you have with you have demonstrated that nearly 43% of children under the age of 5 in developing countries, low-income and middle-income countries, are at risk of not achieving their development potential globally. I think also, while there's evidence of what works, and I mentioned some of what works, taking these strategies to scale systematically has not always been prioritized. So for example, we need to strengthen the role of health systems in delivery of intervention packages that include stimulation, interaction, and support of fathers and mothers, but also to turn to the education system to provide opportunities to access quality early pre-primary education, to look at what social welfare can do about violence against children and deinstitutionalization, and to look at what society can do to support parents in their care-giving roles, especially as economies evolve and increasingly both parents have to work. So issues of breastfeeding at work, issues of care and support to mothers and fathers as they are both in the workforce need to be considered. And lastly, there's a gap around evidence of programming related to humanitarian crises. So while we think of early childhood development as being something that's based on delivery platforms and systems that are in place in situations that are relatively stable, where governance is relatively well entrenched, what do we do in situations increasingly around the world where fragility prevails? What do you do in Eastern DR Congo? What do you do in South Sudan? What do you do in Syria or Yemen, where that focus on early childhood development is equally important, if not more important, than in places where violence and instability does not prevail? So these are some of the gaps that we need to keep working at and that we are working on with the partners inside this room. As we look both to what works and what has been achieved, and to the challenges that still remain, we're committed to scaling up ECD in countries around the world and supporting this universal agenda. Using the evidence from the Lancet, we will be shortly publishing our own ECD strategy in UNICEF. And in trying to operationalize that strategy, we really welcome partnership with you as part of the ECD Action Network and look forward to continuing our support to action at scale to achieve results for children in the early years. We thank you again for this opportunity to be here today, and congratulations on this launch. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you for UNICEF's leadership on this issue for such a long time. It's going to continue to be pivotal as we look at the issues ahead. I'm going to now turn the mic and indeed the floor over to Dr. Stephen Lai, who is a member of the steering committee that oversaw the development of the series, one of Canada's great scholars in this field, the founding director of the Fraser Mustard Institute for Human Development at the University of Toronto, and now the director of the Alliance for Human Development, a great partner of the Aga Khan Development Network for a long time. Stephen is going to provide some remarks on behalf of the Alliance, but then also introduce the first panel. You'll have three members of the steering committee talking a bit about the contents of the report. We'll take a short break, and then we have 5 brief presentations looking at different dimensions of this institutionally and programmatically, both at home here in Canada as well as abroad, and we'll have a chance for a bit of a discussion. So we'll start with words from Stephen and an overview of the report. Stephen.
Thanks very much, Khalil, for those kind words, and thank you to you and your colleagues for making this amazing space available to us to host this afternoon's event. I'd also like to thank Mr. Ted Shaban, for his powerful comments, I think, about the importance of ECD, and also for UNICEF's leadership in this area over many years. My colleagues and I within the Alliance for Human Development have had the privilege to work very closely with UNICEF, particularly with Pia Brito and Tony Lake. And we've really, I think, been able to help define the importance of the science behind why early environments are so critical to a child's development, particularly of her brain. As alluded to by Khalil, the Alliance for Human Development is a new platform created to advance research on the importance of early life exposures to a child's lifelong health, learning, and well-being. It builds upon the success of the Fraser Mustard Institute for Human Development, and we seek to build a global network of researchers and practitioners focused on advancing early child development and contribute to national and global policy agenda around ECD. AHD is administratively within the Lunenfeld Tannenbaum Research Institute at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto, and our research programs are funded by a number of agencies, including CIHR, IDRC, Aga Khan Foundation, and the Gates Foundation. So I think this is a very exciting and transformative time for those of us in the field of ECD. The work of UNICEF, WHO, and the World Bank, as well as international foundations and CSOs, have recognized the critical importance of ECD in global efforts to reduce inequities across nations. As you'll hear later in the program, the Canadian government and Canadian funding agencies have been at the forefront of efforts to advance research and policy development in this area. Over the past several years, and it seems like actually a long, long time, my colleagues and I had the opportunity to work with an outstanding team of individuals on the Lancet series. I'm happy, obviously, that Pia Brito and Sophie Butter are here from that panel, but also Stephen Matthews from AHD and Tyler Vivaldi were all part of the Lancet team. The Lancet series was launched in Washington last October, and since then has been presented in a number of countries around the world. But it's a particular pleasure now to have the opportunity to present the Lancet series here in Canada and have such a great audience from academia, NGOs, and policy circles here. The Lancet series has triggered the efforts of the global community to come together under the Sustainable Development Goals to ensure that children not only survive, but thrive. The recent formation of the ECD Action Network, as Ted alluded to, in which UNICEF has played such an important role, offers the opportunity not only to support initiatives for children and families within the SDGs, but create a movement to support coordination and partnerships across agencies and organizations. The Lancet series examines the latest data on ECD, the cost and effectiveness of existing interventions, and the importance of working collaboratively to expand successful programs and policies to support families. The series benefited from dozens of contributions from researchers across the world. I'm happy to introduce today Dr. Zulfi Bhutta, who's the co-director of the Centre for Global Child Health at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto and the founding director of the Centre of Excellence in Women's and Child Health at the Aga Khan University, and also Dr. Pia Brito, the Chief and Senior Advisor on ECD at UNICEF. And they'll join me later in presenting the key findings of the series. We'll focus first on the burden faced by low and middle income countries and what science tells us about the importance of this early period in a child's life, the first 2,000 days, as Ted said. Dr. Brito will review the multi-sectoral interventions that support child's development, and Dr. Bhutta will discuss how interventions can be brought to scale and their cost effectiveness and how we can bring all this together. So if I perhaps turn to the first slide, I think, as I said before, this is, I think, a momentous occasion, not just because we're all gathered here to launch the Lancet series, but because within the series, we set out an evidence-based roadmap that, if acted upon, will improve the lives of hundreds of millions of children and allow countries to reap the economic dividend of a more healthy and more productive society. The new series brings important new understanding, concepts, and opportunities to advance the development of children. We focused on the critical role of the first 1,000 days and then the second 1,000 days, based on remarkable new science that is changing the way in which we think about how early environments impact long-term developmental potential of children. We do so understanding that this period during pregnancy, infancy, and early childhood integrates into a life course context in which child health and well-being, the education and empowerment of adolescents, and the health of adults entering into motherhood and fatherhood also promote the health and well-being of children. Our analyses use new metrics to provide better grounded estimates of the global burden of risk for poor developmental outcomes, as well as to incorporate risks beyond those traditionally used of poverty and stunting. We introduced the concept of nurturing care based on new science that shows how the developing brain needs nutrition and stimulation and protection. Nurturing care recognizes the child's need for health, nutrition, security and safety, responsive caregiving, and early learning. It takes place in the context of parents and families through service providers and across many sectors, which together provide the essential care for children to survive and thrive. If I can have the next slide. So I just wanted to take you on an amazing journey, that first 1,000 to 2,000 days. It's one that, if you can see in the little insets there, starts with a single cell, which is the fertilized egg. And then over the course of just a mere 40 weeks, results in the birth of a remarkable new human being. And then over the next 3 to 4 years, to that young girl going off to school for the first day, full of excitement, enthusiasm, ready to take on the world. As I said, the building blocks, the architectural plan, if you will, the blueprint for that development is contained within that single cell, within the DNA of that single cell. And that sets out the broad strokes of that development. But importantly, what science tells us is that the environment around that developing child is critically important in molding and shaping her development. Have the next slide. In fact, what we know now is that a parent's health and well-being, even before pregnancy, the pregnancy environment and the environment during infancy and childhood interacts with that genetic blueprint to set children on different trajectories which will impact their lifelong health, learning, and behavior. Quite simply, the quality and timing of these early environments shape a child's future potential. Next slide, please. And those children that develop in adverse environments are challenged in their developmental potential. And unless we can introduce interventions, will not reach their developmental potential. And this sets up the inequities in health and economic achievement that we see around the world. Next slide, please. So there are multiple environments that can impact that development. Nutrition and health, social and learning, nurturing and protective, and the physical environment. Next slide. So next slide, please. So we know, as Ted said, that poor nutrition stunts the growth of the brain just as it stunts the growth of the body. The brain requires calories. In fact, most of the calories used by the baby in early life go to support brain growth and development. The brain requires good, balanced nutrition. It requires proteins to form the cells. It requires lipids to help form the connections between those brain cells. And we know that undernourished children have damaged systems within their gut to which reduce their ability to actually make good use of the nutrition that we provide them. Next slide, please. We know that poverty is a major driver of developmental delay in children, that socioeconomic status drives disparities in health and education, and that early stimulation is critically important for later brain learning. Next slide. We know that the brain development requires protective, caring environments. Neglect fails to provide the stimulation essential for brain development and function. And abuse and neglect results in elevated levels of stress hormones that can actually damage the cells and their ability to make connections within the brain. Next slide, please. And finally, we know that air pollution is associated with poor cognitive development in children, likely due to a breakdown in the blood-brain barrier and the initiation of inflammation within the brain. We know that water and sanitation are very important to reduce infections, and we know that climate change has a greater impact on children than anyone else. Next slide. And so, what does it take to build a healthy brain? Well, as Ted said, we need nutrition and stimulation and protection. Not one, but all of them. Next slide. As early as 4 weeks after conception, brain cells start to form. And they do so at a remarkable rate of around 250,000 new brain cells every minute. Within the 3rd trimester or so of pregnancy, those brain cells start to make important connections. The brain starts to wire itself. As Ted said, the connections made within those cells amount to about 1,000 new connections every second. The early child's brain is like a sponge. It soaks up and demands stimulation in order to form strong connections that will underlie memory and learning. And those connections are formed in stages, in sensitive periods. Initially in the 3rd trimester and in the first few months of life, those regions of the brain important for sensory stimulation are wired. Later, during early infancy, those centers important for language are wired. And then later on still, those important for higher cognitive function. And if the child does not receive the appropriate stimulation at the time that those regions of the brain are being wired, those regions will not develop optimally. Next slide. So how does this interaction between the environment and development occur? Well, we know that the environment interacts with that genetic blueprint, as I said. We know that all of us here have very small differences in our genetic makeup that are responsible for our different risks of health, our different learning abilities and behaviors. And the environments either amplify or mitigate the impact of those small genetic differences. In addition, while not changing the sequence of our DNA, the environment can actually put chemical marks on that DNA that alter how that program, that genetic blueprint unfolds. And importantly, these chemical marks, called epigenetics, can actually be passed on from one generation to another. Next slide. Also, we know that the pregnancy environment actually contains 3 genomes. It has the mother's genome, the baby's genome in the uterus, but we know that the eggs, the stem cells that will form the eggs of the mother's granddaughter actually form within the fetus. And so that pregnancy environment has the potential to impact a number of generations. And importantly, it's not all about the health and well-being of the mother and the mother's environment. We now know that the father's health and well-being before pregnancy can influence the development of his children. Next slide. So we need to look at a life course approach to early child development. While focusing on the first 1 and 2,000 days, as Ted said, we must understand that adolescent health and education result in increased adult health and human capital going into subsequent pregnancies. And so by focusing on this life course approach, we can bring about optimal change to societies. Next slide. We, as I said, introduced the concept of nurturing care. Next slide. So nurturing care envelops early child development. It comprises all the essential elements for a child to grow physically, mentally, and socially, because it integrates nutrition and health, love and security, protection from danger, and opportunities to learn and discover the world. It integrates those environments in optimal ways to allow optimal development. Next slide. Nurturing care is given by parents and caregivers, but we need to understand ways in which we can increase their capacity to provide nurturing care. How health, nutrition, education, social and child protection services can support those parents, and what national policies can be brought about to support those services. Next slide. As Ted said, the Lancet series identified that 250 million children, that's 43% of under 5 children in low and middle income countries, are at risk of poor developmental outcomes because their environments are not optimal. Next slide. And the risk varies across the country, with particular risk in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide. So, in final way, I'd like to say that in order to optimize a child's development, we need to have multi-sectoral partnerships. They need to be timed to those interventions, need to be timed to those sensitive periods. They need to be sustained across childhood, and they need to be based on science. And now I'd like to invite my colleague, Pia Brito, to come up and continue about the Lancet series.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to continue after Steve on this exciting series. And am I doing my slides? Oh, there is a clicker, this one. Right, I'm in charge. Okay, but that wasn't my slide deck, so let's try again. Yes, we got it. All right. So, today we are really at a historic moment, Because what is so exciting is that the science that tells us how we learn and earn and be happy and healthy is coming of age. But alongside that, there is this global recognition to the Sustainable Development Goals that this matters. And it's not often that these movements come together in this synergistic way. And what we tried to do with the Lancet papers is unpack this science and say, what are the implications for operationalizing this in response to the global development agenda? So it's truly meaningful that this has come together and we have a chance to talk about it now. This is a little visual analytic that tries to capture the entire Lancet series in one picture. So excuse me to the core scientists in this room who think that we've taken some liberties here, but I'm just going to talk about the first part of this picture, and Zulfi is going to follow me with the latter part. But basically, every child has a right to thrive. And the child's brain develops the fastest in the first few years of life, as Steve told us. Why? In a context of nurturing care, which has health, nutrition, safety, responsiveness, and early learning, all mixed together. The latter part of the slide is what Zulfi is going to talk about, the results and cost of inaction. But this is really encapsulate the entire messages of the Lancet series. So what I'm going to focus on are the interventions. How is this science translated, and what can we do with it? Okay? So the first thing we learn is we've got to start early. And early means early. And here we are talking about pregnancy. We are talking about early in life. The second, it's supporting the child means we are supporting the parents and caregivers. Even though the term says early childhood development, it's actually the parents and the caregivers who are the key architects of that environment who need to be supported. Third, the science says we need multiple protective inputs at the same time, not just one thing at a time. They need to come together at the same time. And finally, it's not just a moment in time, but we're looking across the life course. So those were the key nuggets of information from the science that now we need to apply to our program action. Okay? So we did a review of the interventions because we really wanted to address some key elements of the environment that are adverse for children. The first is, if we just look at basically what's going on every day in a young baby or a child's life, we found that only 10, at most 40% of kids really have exposure to playing, singing, laughing, talking, all these interactions that really make a difference, okay? And then we said, what are some other elements that are important for a child? And we found another huge gap, that when we look at these early bonding, interaction, relationships that matter, and the essence of play, it's only at most a third of children who are getting that type of engagement or interaction. Then we looked at what sort of support do parents need. You know, all of us, whoever is in this form of parenting, what support do we need with health, hygiene, nutrition? And we found huge, huge gaps. So while the science was painting this beautiful picture of all things that can happen, you flipped the coin around and you looked at the reality of lives, and it wasn't the same. So really, what is it that we can get from the review of the literature? So the group of co-authors on this series looked at the literature from the last publication of the ECD Lancet from 2011 to April 2015 in different disciplinary groups of health, of nutrition, of protection, of education, and formed teams where they reviewed the literature both in terms of the systematic reviews, but also the new studies that had come in place, and looked across the different areas of work. And we looked at different outcomes of basic child health, but we also looked at disability, morbidity, stunting, all the different outcomes that comprise child development. What we found was a series of 15 interventions to be critical and important for improving child development outcomes. Some of those were like Care for Child Development that Ted talked about, which was a package developed by UNICEF and WHO that really promotes stimulation, responsivity, nurturance, and care, where community workers are trained and they can go out to families and deliver this package. It's very simple. It has basic things that can be done, easy to present materials. So there was sort of a range of interventions of this nature that could be delivered from a health platform. But then we also discovered some very interesting interventions from other sectors that we hadn't looked at so closely. For example, social protection, safety networks, and also looking at cash transfer programs. And several of those demonstrated to us that how, with the support of cash and programming, you can really improve child outcomes. So the range of programs we looked at across these effective interventions really showed to us that some of our programs were occurring at a specific moment in time, as you see across from this ruler, from adolescence to school age. Some of them occur at a specific moment in time, but then some interventions occur across, and they're not so age-specific. But these interventions all have a meaningful impact on the child's developing skills. But what we also learned in our review was these single sector individual interventions are necessary, but they're not sufficient. And they need to be packaged together in a meaningful manner that addresses the risks, but also includes the three components of nutrition, stimulation, and protection. So these three are more or less like the active ingredients of this package. So you can have a single intervention that's doing a great job and you can demonstrate impact, but actually when you package the three together and you look at the risk and the age of the child, you even get a bigger jump. And then finally we saw that in order to launch that package, you've got to find the right platform. If you're doing it through a health system or you're doing it through the social welfare system, you've got to find the right platform. And in our review, we said the advantages of bringing these together is you address many common risks at the same time. Because oftentimes what happens in our systems is that we're addressing one thing at a time and we're losing opportunities and we're wasting resources. We also found with this package you can look at multiple outcomes at the same time because we don't really learn and then we walk and then we talk. All our outcomes come together. We also found for families this was really helpful because there was a consistency in messages. And it was practical for families to have a whole child approach because families, we don't see our kids as broken up into sort of different domains. So, for example, the most common intervention that we all know about is when we bring nutrition and stimulation together. It has a very strong set of multiplier effects in this sensitive window of child. It addresses both the child's physical and mental development, and the health workers managed to integrate these messages very well. And Zulfi led some very exciting work in Pakistan with the lady health workers. When they combined these two together, the double impact that was shown. So in the Lancet, when we looked at this review together, there were a core set of packages that started to emerge. The first is family support and strengthening. As we mentioned, the literature was very clear. It's not just the child, it's the family. So the family support and strengthening says you have the basic service, you give the skills to the parents, and you have the support through cash transfer or safety nets. And that package comes together as a whole package with the three elements, nutrition, protection, stimulation, but it also addresses the family as a whole. Similarly, the caring for caregiver or multi-generational nurturing care package. And while our series really couldn't capture sufficient literature on families in fragility and humanitarian contexts, one of the things that really seemed to be emerging is in order for parents to be able to care for their children when they're going through so much adversity, is to be able to care for themselves as well. And this multi-generational package really captures that. It captures the understanding the parent as who they are and the adult, but also in their role of parenting. And finally, really looking closely at the early learning package to understand that provision in the second 1,000 days goes beyond literacy and arithmetic to increase and include safety and protection. So the learning and protection package came together. These packages really are a way now to respond through the science in a more holistic and cohesive manner to child outcomes. And here we have a little visual illustration of how that occurs. So I know it's all very tiny, but on the top right-hand side in that little box of matrix are probably the interventions you would select from your different areas that you're already working on after doing your situational analysis of what the risks are, what the children need. You apply a few principles to that, and then you see a little bundle comes together. That is your bundle or your package of interventions that you're going to take forward. Then you need to find the right entry point that is going to deliver this bundle for you. Is it going to be your community health platform? What is a platform that's going to deliver it? Then you train the service provider, and it could be someone in the health system, a nurse, a doctor, or it could be a community health worker. To support that, we need to have community mobilization, and we need to have community messages, and that's where you see the C4D, the community for development, and you're able to reach the family with a holistic set of messages. So the pathway from the single set of interventions into the operationalization of going to deliver the services requires building capacity of the workforce in a key manner. Also to support this is the partnership around the Early Childhood Development Action Network. This network is really focused on accelerating the young child targets of the SDGs, the nutrition, the education, and the protection targets, to be able to support countries to prioritize, to understand what are the risks, and to be, through collaborative partnerships, really take these multi-sectoral packages together. So the question facing us in 2017 is, now we know what interventions are effective. We have an answer to that question. The question facing us now is, what are we going to do to guide the work at scale? We have the tools in our toolbox. How are we going to employ them? What are the most effective strategies to employ them? And how can we impact the largest number of children? Because we cannot gather, again, with a number of 250 million children not achieving their potential. That number has to be reduced, and we have to act fast, and we have to act at scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve and Pia. So Steve has already introduced me. I represent two academic institutions, the Center for Global Child Health in Toronto and the Aga Khan University. But I also have two additional hats, which give me a slight leeway in this section of the program. So I happen to be the president of the International Pediatric Association, so I represent over 1 million pediatricians worldwide who are your natural partners in this endeavor. And also with my friend Stefan Peterson at UNICEF, I happen to co-chair the Countdown to 2030 initiative, which also holds your feet to the fire. So it does the monitoring and evaluation, and increasingly it wants to move away from just pure survival to issues of child development and issues of thrival. So I've been asked to summarize the last paper of this series, and the last paper typically summarizes the main conclusions and then gives you a way forward. So forgive me if I do summarize some of what my colleagues have said. So you've seen many conceptual frameworks, and in the conceptual frameworks, one of the things emphasized is the critical nature of early life, whether it's fetal life, early infancy, or early childhood. And those are the periods where risk factors aggregate around creating risks, and you respond to many of those risk factors on the basis of your environment, both the social as well as the genetic, epigenetic environment, and various influences that you have in this process pathway, which also relate to disease and risk factors for inflammation. And they really do impact adult outcomes. So what we are talking about is not just outcomes which are important for childhood, but are important throughout your life course. And my colleague, Tyler Voiveda, who's sitting at the back, spent a lot of time looking at the various risk factors in relation to interventions, because you want to put those interventions in place in order to mitigate against those risk factors. And as Steve and Pia have said a lot of those interventions are in that early life period. The first 1,000 days, you could argue, is actually first 2,000 days because you want to bring not only the period during pregnancy, but the period before pregnancy. But I want to introduce to you some of the emerging science that tells us that windows of opportunity are actually wider than what we may want to narrow in that sense. And in particular, in the last few years, we've also begun to recognize the importance of the adolescent period. And I want to underscore that very importantly, not only in the context of adolescence being important for reproductive health outcomes, but also adolescence being important in the context of learning opportunities within that period. This recent study in Neuron, just published last year, clearly underscored the importance of brain functionality in adolescence in response to various learning stimuli. So the important thing to underscore is that your windows of opportunity for influencing child development are wider than the first 1,000 days. And I think we need to recognize this when we look at the life course. And I particularly wanted to share this with you because in just about 2 weeks' time, we'll assemble in this very city around the Global Adolescent Conference. And we need to, therefore, be very aware of the range of interventions that we have to have in place for this age group. Now, Pia has done a fantastic job in terms of putting the evidence-based interventions together. They go through, as you can see over here, from pre-pregnancy, preconception, childbirth, newborn, so on and so forth. And they can be very effectively packaged together as interventions that reflect various packages that can be delivered through health services. And those can be through the maternal health programs, adolescent health programs, care in and around childbirth, and they have generally been packaged in the same way as we do for improving survival. And I don't think the Lancet series or anybody has asked us to move away from that criticality of integration of interventions. So one dominant message that needs to emerge from this large evidence review that was done as part of this series was that there is tremendous complementarity. There is tremendous complementarity around not only saving lives, but also improving outcomes. And I want to give you just one example as I move on. So Tyler and team put together the evidence around just one area. What can we do to improve birth outcomes? Reducing low birth weight, reducing small for gestational age births, and reducing the risk of preterm births. Now, this busy slide, which is the first plot of the kinds of interventions that we have there that can reduce these adverse birth outcomes, all give you enormous opportunity for improving developmental outcomes throughout the life course. Yet we have not used the opportunity of not only looking at these birth outcomes in isolation, but also opportunities for improving quality of survival and quality of what interventions can be packaged together as we reduce low birth weight, as we reduce small for gestational age births. So that's the fundamental change in thinking that needs to be brought through the traditional MNCH and nutrition sector. These packages have already been spoken about. These multi-sectoral packages are extremely important in terms of bringing things together and also linking to delivery platforms. So I want to say a word or two about delivery platforms. These delivery platforms need to be contextualized. Every country has a delivery platform that may or may not look at task shifting, but it allows you to see what can be layered on top of what exists rather than create something entirely de novo. Some countries may want to create a de novo program, but more often than not, there are things and opportunities in place that you would use to layer your interventions on existing services. They need to have some common principles. Those common principles have to depend upon reach, who can reach maximum numbers, and also which platforms can reduce inequities and gaps, those that can reach the most marginalized. And in many contexts, the most marginalized of the families are not necessarily rural or those who live in distant populations, but living right under our nose in the urban slums and in some of the marginalized populations in mega cities. Integration with health services is a no-brainer. So we also need to move away from this either-or concept. The child development can only be done through an education sector or a sector that does not have health at its center. The fundamental thing that we struggled with initially, but then found a way forward to underscore in the Lancet series was that there is tremendous synergy, particularly in that early period of the first 2,000 days between the health sector and opportunities for enhancing child development and maternal health within those sectors. Then finally, these have to be effective and affordable. So there's no point in coming up with something that requires a brand new cadre of health workers or workers if you have an opportunity of layering something within existing health workers. Other platforms that Pia alluded to are things that are possible within your social protection sectors, and now increasingly large number of countries, including my own home country, have some of the largest cash transfer programs, sometimes conditional, sometimes unconditional. And they offer an enormous opportunity for linking some of these concepts of child health and development together. Water, sanitation, hygiene that is up here is an enormous opportunity for also bringing in elements of child development and reduction in malnutrition, particularly stunting in some of these environments. Has this been done? So whenever we present something like this, people try to say, well, give me one example of where this has been done. And the answer to that is that there are examples where people have reached various elements of all of this. Now, there may not be a gold standard program out there necessarily yet, but there are many examples that give us hope that countries have been able to achieve things at scale, been able to integrate stuff, have been able to bring in the close collinearity of some of the health sector, nutrition, and child protection interventions. And there are a large number of examples that are detailed in the Lancet series that I don't have time to go through just yet. But to give you one example, let's take Chile. Not necessarily a high-income country, but Chile was able to introduce this program, which became law about 8-9 years ago, and is federally funded, and it combines health services, parenting support, and preschool services, and has, importantly, universal services and care there. And this has been able to reach 80% of the population. We happen to have had an interaction with this group. To reach 80% of the population through a program like this is no mean achievement. We struggle to get vaccination up at that level. So there are examples of countries who have done this well. The common features of such programs, where they have been done, is that they are generally driven by enormous focus on reducing inequities and reaching the most marginalized and poor. They are informed on the best evidence. So nobody airy-fairy just puts packages together if they're not based on good evidence, because eventually you will have to demonstrate impact. And they are generally supported by governments who are, in turn, clearly dependent upon enormous political commitment to this initiative. So just like I see this in zero hunger programs, eliminating poverty programs, so child development programs also come from the same kind of philosophy of reaching and improving outcomes for those who are currently not being reached. They require a policy environment, and I want to spend a second on this. The policy environment requires the inaction and implementation of regulations and policies that will make tangible impact. And there are some examples given in our Lancet series of what does that mean. Breastfeeding support may not necessarily emerge immediately as an enormously important child development intervention. But believe me, it is one of those survival and child development interventions that one is always amazed that even many developed countries don't have. What does breastfeeding support mean? It means that you ought to be able to provide maternity leave to women, working women, so that they can do so. India, a country of 1.5 billion people, has only just in the last couple of months, and through a federal government edict, been able to increase its maternity leave to 28 weeks, which makes it possible for women to breastfeed for 6 months. Vast majority of low and middle income countries don't have this. And you all know of the political debate south of our border in terms of making this a reality even in the United States. So these kind of national policies that are based on the best evidence, that allow people to do something simple like take time off to look after sick children, hugely important for what we are talking about, is integration of health, nutrition, and child development. Can we afford this? This is the other question that I'm asked. Well, this is all so expensive. What can you do if you have limited budgets? Now, you build infrastructure because it's not going to yield results tomorrow. All over Africa, you're building highways and motorways, not because they're going to yield results tomorrow, but because you look at them in the long-term context of investment. So let's look at affordability very quickly. So the Lancet series modeled, as an example, 2 interventions. And these interventions were around support for maternal mental health, which we currently don't have within our programs, and a number of home visits to promote nurturing care that Pia was talking about. We looked at these in 2 scenarios. One was a medium coverage, or let's say you get up to about 58, 60% coverage, and the other was high-level coverage like Chile was able to achieve, maybe even higher, 98% coverage. And what we found was very interesting. What we found was that at medium-level coverage, if you take per capita expenditures, you're looking at an additional 20 cents per capita per year. And at the highest level, almost universal coverage, you're looking at just half a dollar, 50 cents per capita per year. Now, some people may multiply this and translate it into a figure and say, gosh, this is unaffordable. I can't do this today. But let's look at what is the cost of not doing it. So one way of looking at this is, if you don't make that investment, what is it that it is currently costing your exchequer and future development in terms of not achieving what the potentials are? So Steve and Ted had talked about the number of children, 250 million children. Their current cost in terms of economic potential to the population is around 26, a quarter of the average adult income for those countries. And if you do more specific sums by countries, you begin to see the cost of not reducing stunting, which is, anything ranging from about 4 to around 13% of GDP. Or if you went even further and looked at models of what would happen in specific countries, you find that where existing platforms are there, such as these countries at the bottom who have a preschool education program, the cost may be much, much lower of doing this than compared to other countries where you have nothing like this available. So the bottom line is, this is affordable if you take that into account. So the way forward, ladies and gentlemen, just to conclude. Firstly, the science now tells us that we need to do the right investments. And those investments need to start way before pregnancy, even preconceptionally, with the right interventions focused at the right age groups. They need to expand the political will that we currently have around achieving not only survival goals, but also improving human social capital. And they need to build on what has been the great success of the Millennium Development Goals, is building health sector interventions for maternal and child health. They are a natural building block for adding things on top that will improve outcomes. We clearly need to focus early, but as I've said already, don't lose the margins. Just like we lost the focus on adolescents in the Millennium Development Goals, I think it will be a mistake to lose the focus on some of the opportunities in those age groups. Whether we like it or not, whether we have our own views, the Sustainable Development Goals are here. And all of you, your countries, have signed up to it. As far as I'm aware, not a single country of the world has abstained or said, no, we'll go and consult our parliaments. Everybody has signed up to Sustainable Development. The biggest challenge, I think, for Canada is that Canada has signed up for the SDGs. And therefore, a lot of the indicators that are there at the core of the SDGs will be there. The Sustainable Development Goals are 17. They may seem large, but they're all interconnected. So health is just one goal, goal 3. But all of the others that you see around it, on quality education, on gender equality, on eliminating hunger, extreme poverty, reducing inequality, social justice partnerships, they are all part of the same package. And there is now, fortunately, thanks to Pia and her team and a lot of other people who worked very hard to make this happen, a very specific ECD goal. So in the Sustainable Development Goals, Target 4.2 calls for ensuring that all children, all girls and boys, wherever they are, have access to quality early childhood development care and pre-primary education by 2030. So this requires a fair amount of specific actions. First is contextual and country-specific planning. I can't stand here today and make a plan for Pakistan or for Kenya. That has to be done locally, based on what they have, what they want to invest in. Similarly, it requires making omelets. It requires bashing heads, cracking eggs, and bringing people together. So people who don't typically work together, people in health, education, nutrition, social protection, water sanitation, hygiene, we have no alternative but to bring people together and get them to think, plan, and work towards this. And this can not be necessarily done without some degree of central government coordination. So we are asking that in the Sustainable Development Goal process, thinking process, that there needs to be some level of coordination between ministries rather than a free-for-all in this process. There is a need for research. So I did throw in one slide because our group has worked with many of you to look at implementation research gaps. And Ted, I wanted you to see the number 3 gap here, which is around humanitarian. Refugee populations, migrant children. I was recently in Sweden about 10 days ago. Sweden has accepted close to around 500,000 Syrian refugees. And they're acutely aware of the fact that they need to work with that population, not only to understand what the issues and challenges are, but importantly to see how they can optimize, no matter what the adversity those populations have gone through, their integration and their contribution to Swedish society. So I want to finish by just citing from Tony Lake, great supporter and somebody who has spearheaded a lot of this, a great friend of pediatricians. He came to our Congress in Vancouver. So he asked the question, how do we unlock the life-changing benefits of early brain development and function? I want to cite from his text. So he said, invest early and to give every child a fair chance in life from the very start. Invest equitably, because the children with the least benefit the most. So true. Invest smartly. Evidence-based implementation and programming. Not only in education, but in health, nutrition, and protection, because they all work together and in a synergistic manner. And importantly, we do it now. This is the time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much to our first speakers for introducing with such pith and elegance the findings of the Lancet series. You can get a sense, I think, immediately of how rich the content is and the scope of the work, spanning the basic science all the way to the severe issues around implementation and even costing. We have a few minutes now for at least one round of questions and comments from the audience before we take a quick break and then move to our next panel. So the floor is open for questions, comments, reactions from the crowd. Right here. And if you could just introduce yourselves when you, briefly.
Yep, I'm Kelly Stone. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Association of Family Resource Programs.
Welcome, Kelly.
And thanks. We're a 40-year-old organization. I'm the association, and we have members across the country who serve about 500,000 vulnerable children and families a year. So my question is, and we've talked a bit, Stephen, how can we be a part of this? How can we, given our breadth across the country and others like us, and certainly not just us, we're able to reach your target audience. We are the ones out in the field with the folks at the coalface who are reaching these families. We have the infrastructure. So how can we and others like us be dialed into your initiative in a very, very concrete way in the years to come?
So
Thanks,
I think,
Kelly. So, you know what, I might take a couple and then we'll ask you to respond. Margaret had her hand up here.
Thank you very much, Margaret Biggs. I'm the chair of the Board of Directors for the International Development Research Center. My question was really a research-related question. It might have been on your last slide there, sir, which was, what has your research told you so far about remediation? So if a child has adverse effects, what are the potential over their life course for remediation to pick up and whatever. And then, of course, in Canada, we have generational effects like other countries do. Like we look at our Indigenous population and the impacts of residential schools, and we have a generation that's been adversely affected and probably, as we've now learned, genetic markers in there. So what do you know now about the possibility for remediation and for rejuvenating the potential that people are born with? Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Margaret. A couple more. Did we have one over here? No? Dominic.
Thanks. I'm Dominic Schofield with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. And when we started working on early childhood development, it was very much from a nutrition lens. And as you spoke, I think this is such a step up from the previous series because you really are addressing the questions of integration and showing the science behind that. So I really congratulate the authors and the way you presented that today. I think it does set a roadmap. One of the things that strikes me, though, is as each one of the different interventions in the bundles that you were describing have had their own difficulties in scaling up. Yeah. And so when we think about the synergies in child survival, the synergies in development outcomes, they're all, we think, also synergies in taking things to scale. The overlap in the Venn diagrams of these various interventions could lead to scale if they're harnessed correctly. What we have found is that a lot of the effort has been on public systems delivered approaches, the way we've structured our society. But there's a whole lot going on through markets that could also be harnessed. And I think conditional cash transfers is sort of one piece of that puzzle, but there's a lot more going on with the private sector and how you can incentivize the private sector to mobilize some of these outcomes at scale as well in a way that's sustainable. So I just wanted to make sure that that was also on the table. Thank you.
I'm going to dictate the order of our responses because I want to end with Kelly's, I think, very provocative question about the practical implications of all this. But let's start with the research question. What do we know about remediation after this 2,000 days? You want to start, Zulf, because you talked about adolescents.
Yeah, so we know a lot more than we did a decade ago. Do we know enough to be very dogmatic that, this works, but we don't, because there have been relatively few integrated programs. But I could tell you a few things. For example, first thing is that there is enormous evidence, direct and indirect, about resilience, which means that no matter how severe the exposure, and particularly how prolonged it may be, families and children therein have demonstrated enormous resilience in various geographies, which tells you a lot in terms of how interventions and how various sectors can relate to it. A few things we do know is that it is much more challenging amongst orphans than it is within family units. So from the literature available, any effort to keep the family unit together is much, much better than trying to do anything in isolation. Number two, we see a lot of benefit from starting early. So first 1,000, 2,000 days, clearly very important. We see also the converse on the adolescent side. So I've looked at this, as you might hear in about 2 weeks, looked at the evidence around adolescent interventions in great depth. And we've published whole supplements on this recently. What is very clear is that interventions in adolescence generally work very poorly if they start late. So the earlier you start, the better it is. Which brings me to the current orphan area right now that we have even within health, which is the entire school age period. It seems as if, Ted, the world focused so much on the under fives and now has jumped from the under fives to the adolescents that nothing exists in between. And that is true both in terms of numbers, in terms of our knowledge of causes of morbidity and mortality, and importantly, intervention strategies. So what we do know from the remediation side is that if you really want to have an impact on some of those age groups like young mothers, adolescents themselves for their own health, you're better off starting early in school age period, and typically around nutrition, health, and mental health interventions. If you don't do that at that time, by the time you get to adolescence, it's typically too late, not only in terms of impact, but also in terms of responsiveness. You're also hitting an age group where your delivery systems become a lot more difficult. So I hope that gives you some sense of where we're going. But the important thing to recognize is that we see enormous evidence of resilience, and not resilience on its own, but where programs, and particularly early child education programs, have been able to make a lot of difference in those settings.
Pierre, can I ask you to reflect on Dominic's question a little bit about markets, the private sector, and scale? Is there a path to exponential scale that's being hidden from view because of our over-focus on public systems as the principal means of delivery?
That was a really good question, because I think, for example, the points that came up at the end on the leaves, for example, the types of support families need, a lot of the leave policies are controlled by the private sector. Maternity leave, paternity leave, breastfeeding breaks. So while the relationship with private sector traditionally is considered around commodities and what commodities does the private sector provide, now we know increasingly the relationship with the private sector is, A, they could be a service provider, either like a basic health or education. But second, because they are an employer, they have a lot to do in the way a family environment is being structured. And at UNICEF, we are now more and more recognizing the importance of partnering private sector to uphold child rights, exactly for this reason, because they are such a dominant player. And also in the new SDG architecture, the private sector actually had created a compact and a key set of outcomes to which linked the SDG goals. So I think in any conversation going forward, not working with the private sector is actually missing a huge constituency. And we had a conversation earlier on who you can bring the same partners all the time to a network, but the network is not effective. Actually, what makes the network effective is when you bring the non-traditional partners, or you bring the messengers who people don't expect. And when you bring the private sector champions to an issue like early childhood, it's amazing how much more attention and awareness you get. So in addition to their role of being a service provider and sort of being an employer, they also are very, very powerful champions for these very key messages. Recently at the World Bank Spring meetings, a lot of heads of CEOs of companies talked about investing in the workplace for an investment in the workforce. And that was a very powerful argument that came from many leaders of the industry.
Can I ask you to respond to Kelly's question? Here you have someone representing a very large network of civil society efforts coming into direct contact with families every day, represents kind of emblematic of a whole community of institutions, presumably in Canada, but around the world, who are at the front line. What's the relationship between kind of the very important but a little bit arcane world of kind of research and evidence and the daily pressures and work of the thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people who are trying to do this work every day?
Yeah, so I think this is a critically important issue, and it's how we're going to make a difference. And I think it's one of the reasons we've sort of evolved from the Fraser Mustard Institute as a purely sort of academic initiative to the Alliance for Human Development, in which we're really seeking to make those connections and say, we all want the same objective. How can we work together, break down not just disciplinary silos, but networking capabilities to work together on the within maybe the Canadian context, and something the Alliance might be one mechanism. I think as Ted alluded to, the ECD Action Network is a remarkable example of how you have UN agencies, you have global foundations, you have business, you have the academic community, you have civil society organizations now coming together to really do exactly, Kelly, what you said. How can we work together? How can we contribute to bringing this goal of supporting those most vulnerable in our society to actually reach their developmental potential?
So Kelly, let's come back to this as an important theme in the next kind of session as well, because I think partly we're going to have to ask you that same question, which is, hearing everything you're hearing, like, like, what do you need? What does it mean for you as you hear all this to translate it back to the large constituency that you are working with every day? So let's come back to that before we end today. Thank you all. We're not releasing you from duty, but we are releasing you from the stage. You'll be part of the next discussion. What we're going to do is take the briefest of breaks, enough for you to refill a cup of coffee or visit the bathroom, which is in that corner or downstairs. And we're going to reformulate the stage and come back for a conversation about how this all gets translated institutionally and programmatically in a number of different contexts. So let's take about 7 minutes now and come back. Thanks. All right, we're going to get started. Thank you very much for being disciplined in your break taking. We're going to move now into the second portion of our conversation, having now benefited from the presentations that provided the summary of the results of the research presented in this Lancet series, which, by the way, is available online in its full form. It's about 75 pages, and although you have the executive summary, my own view is that at least flipping through the entire document has a lot of benefit. You get both a series of commentary by a series of global authorities, and then they actually present the 3 research papers. So well worth it in my mind. What we're going to do now is take the next hour and a bit, and we've invited 5 perspectives whose concision, pith, and brevity will be rewarded, at least by my admiration, if nothing else, who have been asked to provide brief 5-minute perspectives about the key issues on the, did we say 7? The key issues arising out of the Lancet report. We've got 2 different types of perspectives. Stephen McGurk, Vice President of the International Development Research Center, and Shu Li, who is the Scientific Director of the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. We're going to invite them to say a bit about what this all means institutionally. So as IDRC looks forward and as the Canadian Institute for Health Research looks forward, how do they think about this issue as part of their ongoing and forward institutional programs? Kofi Marfo, the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Development, Carly Silver, the Vice President at Grand Challenges Canada, and Catherine Birkin, scientist at the Sick Kids Research Institute, are all coming from the perspective of actual programming institutions that are doing things to advance this issue. And we're going to invite each of them to talk a bit about how they're thinking about this issue in relation to their work and as it relates to some of the outcomes of the Lancet series. So that's the agenda in front of us. I'm going to ask Stephen McGurk and Shu Li to start off, and then I'm going to ask the other 3, and then we're going to be able to have a bit of an open conversation. I'm going to relieve myself from this position behind the podium and take a position of greater strength on the floor, looking at you directly, in the hopes that might exert all kinds of implicit control over your, at least the length, if not the quality, of your presentations. And I always like to begin with someone who can handle the pressure. Stephen McGurk, Vice President, International Development Research Center. Steve, over to you.
Thanks very much, Khalil. It's a delight and a privilege to be here for the launch of the Lancet series. And let me extend my appreciation to the many authors and colleagues who worked on this series. This third in the series of Lancet pieces on early childhood development is disturbing in a number of ways, not in the wonderful science that underpins it, nor in the recognition of the need for integrated programs and to do these programs at scale. Not at all. We welcome the movement away from single interventions. It's how little has really changed in some fundamental way. If we look outside of China and outside of India, in fact, the situation has not really changed much in much of the rest of the lower and middle income world. And even in China, it's a fairly recent effort. The 2007, I believe, was the first in the Lancet series. I was chairing a Chinese Rural Development Research Institute at that point. I'm still on their board, I no longer chair. And we had research evidence from poor areas of southwest China that suggested how much cognitive development was being and becoming a much stronger issue for the Chinese. And it was the first real evidence for the Chinese that this wasn't just about physical stunting, that this was actually affecting a whole range of longer term development of children, of adults, and their communities. That was very powerful evidence for the Chinese. And we knew, because we were talking directly to Chinese ministers, that it was a real eye-opener for them. And they made some progress, and they really have fairly dramatic progress. Equally, India has made good progress with the Integrated Child Development Program and others that have not reduced stunting so much, but I think reduced the broader concerns around early childhood development. I point to the initiative that Amartya Sen took with the Kolkata initiative of bringing together top policy thinkers from around India to reflect on what were the key concerns and how to build integrated program, in part in reflection to the Lancet series. So they've advanced, but sub-Saharan Africa has not. So yes, 250 million children in lower and middle income countries are at risk of stunting and exposure to extreme poverty, but the number is closer to 3/4 of children in sub-Saharan Africa. That number is virtually unchanged in the decade since this third in a series has started. Yet, much of sub-Saharan Africa has had phenomenal growth rates in that decade. Almost nothing has changed. So I won't touch on the sort of moral compass issues that I think we're all well familiar with and that the Lancet series, I think, does a wonderful job at bringing out. I would stress, and from a narrow institutional perspective, since I've been pushed on this, that vulnerability as an extra stressor is pointed to in the Lancet series, and I think it is an area where more work does need to be done, and in fact, the work that we're starting with the Alliance for Human Development and the Aga Khan Foundation and Kofi is precisely around these issues of how displaced families and displaced children are much, much greater risk of all the same stressors that their broader families and communities in lower and middle income countries are subject to, but with a double whammy. Because in many cases, they're not even eligible for programs that might exist to help them with early childhood development. They're not even citizens in some fundamental way. And this is something that we're very concerned with and working with both civil registration and vital statistics systems, but also on questions of displaced people and their place in host communities, as well as on maternal and child health needs of displaced and host community children and families. So I did appreciate that the series this time has pointed to that as a key research gap, and I will look very carefully, Dr. Bhuta, at the other research gaps, and I'll be the first to admit, unlike Shuli and Carly and Kofi, and now I started down this road, I can't remember your name. Catherine, thank you. God, embarrassing. So I won't say too much more. I'm very struck by how difficult it is when we know what to do, how to do it and how to institutionalize that. Unlike some other aspects of empowerment, where we can use financial institutions and financial markets, this one does not seem as ready-made, and hence the institutional challenge is that much greater. Particularly in lower and middle income settings where, frankly, public institutions are quite weak and don't show enormous signs of being stronger at the level that such programs need to be, which is to say at very local levels, anytime soon. So that's a big challenge and not one that's going away soon. I would also say, since, like Shuli, I'm part of the Canadian government, that this is a top of mind priority for the Canadian government. There's no doubt, whether it's through reductions in early marriage, whether it's in child nutrition, whether it's in early childhood development, whether it's nutrition more generally. These are all serious priorities of the Canadian government, serious priorities for IDRC. So happy to turn the floor over to Shuli for more measured and perhaps more psychically rewarding to Khalil.
Thank you, Steve, for starting us off. From a global research perspective to a Canadian one, Shuli, give us a sense from Canadian Institute for Health Research, how you think about all this?
Well, thank you, Khalil, and congratulations to your organization and to all the authors here for the fine work that you are doing. I bring you greetings from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which, as you know, is Canada's federal health research funding agency, where we invest over $1 billion each year into health research in Canada and actually in other countries as well. Certainly, we look at this whole area of early childhood development in both a focused way as well as in a much broader way. And I'll explain to you in a minute why we look at it in that way. The second thing is that in the area of research, we look at the mechanisms, the reasons, how and why things happen, but also we look at translation. In other words, we are interested in health research in not just understanding what causes these issues and how to deal with them, but how do we actually translate it on a social and societal level and international level so that we can actually harvest the benefits of the research and the understanding and the knowledge that we generate, so that we can actually create the opportunities for change both at the policy and the social level, so that the benefits can accrue to society both in Canada and internationally. So what did I mean by focus and general approach? First of all, we certainly appreciate the importance of early childhood development, as our speakers previously have so elegantly and eloquently described to us. And so we certainly target investments in health research in this area. For example, last year, we actually funded a CIHR-wide, a Canada-wide team in early childhood development for $25 million, which is a substantial investment of the best researchers in the country to come together to look at how do we better understand these issues and what can we actually do. And it's called Child Bright. Some of you may be familiar with that. We also funded for another $10 million a number of teams in preterm birth, because preterm birth is rising as currently the #1 cause of infant mortality and disability in the world. And therefore, that's an area that we're putting a lot of efforts into. In Canada, certainly, preterm birth has increased by 30% in the last 20 years. And that's certainly a cause for concern, and how do we deal with those issues? And certainly, early childhood development among these vulnerable children is something that's of great concern to us. We're also concerned about early childhood development from a more global and generalized perspective. And what do I mean by that? This was alluded to by many of the researchers earlier on, and they spoke about how things are interconnected and interrelated. And that's key to understanding health trajectories. In other words, if you look at the field of what we call DOHAD, or developmental origins of health and disease, it basically posits that you don't develop chronic diseases like obesity and hypertension and diabetes and so on when you are 50 or 60. you start to develop them very early in life. And it's really all these interactions throughout life that determine whether when you're 50 or 60 or beyond, whether you have all these chronic diseases. And chronic non-communicable diseases is currently one of the biggest concerns of governments around the world, both in developed countries and developing countries. Partly because the population is aging, but partly because society is changing. So, if you look at societies like the United States and Canada and so forth, you will know, obviously, that obesity, hypertension, and all these chronic diseases are now of increasing concern. And the incidence of obesity has been rising rapidly. But really, if you look at some of these non-communicable diseases, in the developing countries, it's even a bigger problem. In countries like South Africa, India, Brazil, Mexico, China, etc., obesity and non-communicable chronic diseases is actually one of their biggest problems. And the incidence of, for example, obesity among fertile women in South Africa exceeds 50%. And if you think about what that means, it's huge in terms of the cost to society, in terms of health costs and social costs and economic costs. And so this is a big problem. And so at CIHR, we worked with WHO to develop a program around how do we understand this better and how do we deal with it. This is called the Healthy Life Trajectories Initiative. And we have created, in collaboration with WHO and the funding agencies in South Africa, India, and China, parallel cohorts that are being mobilized in these countries by joint teams of researchers from Canada and all these other countries, South Africa, India, and China, where they are going to be looking at cohorts of populations from preconceptional and then moving forward and following these cohorts up through time to try and better understand the mechanisms, everything from genomics to epigenetics to the environment to social and all these different factors. How do these factors actually interact to cause disease and health over a period of time? And how do we actually change all that? Now, what is unique about these efforts is that, number one, these will not be simply observational cohorts. They're actually going to be intervention cohorts. In fact, some of our researchers here, Steve Lai, Steve Matthews, and Zulfi are all involved in these cohorts, actually. And so we're going to be looking at not just understanding better observational cohorts, but also interventions. So we're not going to wait 50 years to understand it before we start interventions. We're going to begin interventions now, and then look at how that works or not, and how do we change as we go along. That's the first thing. The second thing is that this is a highly coordinated international effort, so that all these cohorts will be mobilized and designed in a common way so that the researchers can actually share the information and learn from each other. And that adds great strength to the research that they will be doing to understand all these different issues better as we go along. The third thing is that because they're intervention cohorts, they'll also be integrating directly into the healthcare delivery systems in these countries, so that they'll be seeing how do we actually make use of the information we have and translate that and then scale it up in all these different societies so that we can actually derive the benefits from the knowledge that we're investing in health research. So this is a very exciting initiative that we are funding and that we hope that we will learn a great deal from all the efforts that they are doing. And it's no surprise that we picked South Africa, China, and India, because these are countries that have economies that are rapidly changing. And so they have moved from a space where there is less resources and nutrition and more physical activity, suddenly to one where the economy is rapidly developing, where you have a different nutrition, a different lifestyle, different activity, and so on. And that's created, these transitions, rapid transitions, have created huge changes that are impacting on people's health. And therefore, that's really important for us to understand better, and also to understand how do we deal with that better. How do we make sure that as we transit in terms of societies and economic development, how do we actually change and intervene so that we can have positive health outcomes as opposed to some of the negative outcomes that we are seeing. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you. That's great. So we've got now two big institutional perspectives with respect to the forward program in relation to the issues under consideration. I want to turn now to the next three panelists each of whom kind of are involved in institutional activity in relation to this. I want to start with Carly. Hello, I'm here. I want to start with Carly. Grand Challenges Canada, a Canadian innovation hub and platform. You started thinking a lot about saving lives. You're now talking about saving brains. What's going on?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm actually going to dive right into one specific example that we've been following through for the last little bit. So for those who don't know, Grand Challenges Canada, our mandate is to fund and support bold ideas with big impact. So the bold ideas is innovation, science, social, business innovation, and the big impact we're looking for is essentially saving and improving lives around the world. Initially, early on in our kind of go at things, we launched about 7 years ago. We prioritized early child development under an initiative called Saving Brains, and have done a series of investments in both knowledge generation as well as more recently in solution-oriented work in this space. So understanding more what works as well as trying to figure out actually how do we get those things to the field. So as we heard earlier today, this idea of the early means early, the human brain is really developing its fastest in those first 1,000 days of life, understanding that things are happening throughout the life course. But this is a pretty precious window that we want to pay attention to. And actually, just to share with you how fast this field still moves, when I was looking up some stuff beforehand, some of my standard sites that I go to just to make sure my facts are straight, they've now revised on the Harvard website for child development, have now revised it from 1,000 neurons per second to 1 million. So haven't done my homework on looking at that. But suffice to say, loads of connections being made in those first few years of life. And if you think about that, we had some great examples of how the neural connections are really formed by the interaction of genes and the environment, and that these are the connections that really form the basis foundation of your brain on which we've got skills and learning and stuff that goes on top of it, and health. So what happens when this early part is disrupted? And as Shu gave me a good opening here, the kind of preterm birth thing is one that I'm going to focus on. So we've got about 15 million kids every year that are being born too soon. And so what this is really meaning is that you've got 15 babies every year whose brains aren't actually developing in the environment that it was kind of made to develop in. So they're kind of leaving the comfort of the uterus early on, and too early, and there's still some really important connections that are needing to be made. And so for those last critical weeks of gestation, we've found a brilliant number of ways to keep those babies alive in the last little while. But it's actually not a surprise if you are taking babies out of that optimal environment that there's actually really long-term impacts that can be had. So on learning disabilities and other lifelong problems that really come down to the fact that these kids are having a real rough go at that early development, early brain development. And we funded a study through Saving Brains that actually looked at the use of kangaroo mother care on preterm babies, and I'm really excited to talk a little bit about the findings we got from that. We also funded another study that concluded that this preterm birth and fetal growth restrictions, so essentially babies not growing enough in utero, are actually the #1 risk factor for poor child development. And if you actually roll that all up, poor child development globally is costing the world about $177 billion in lost wages, and about 70 million years of education lost by those kids for 1 year worth of kids being born. So those are huge numbers. So what can we do about it? So kangaroo mother care is this practice of holding the baby upright against the skin of the mom or the dad or the caregiver, skin to skin, and for as many hours as possible in a day. And in this position, the baby has access to warmth, it has access to exclusive breastfeeding, so nurture, that kind of breast milk. And in some ways, that is kind of the next best option for a baby who's taken outside of the uterus. And it's essentially trying to mimic a lot of the environment of the uterus, and probably is doing it in a better way than an incubator does, gauging by the results that are coming out of some of these longer-term studies. And in the scientific nerdy part of me loves the fact that kangaroo mother care is also self-regulated in the sense that you do it until the baby says, no thanks, I've had enough. And so they're strong enough, they're kind of nourished enough to be able to push away and say, wriggle out and say, I need to see the world now. So there's something kind of interesting about that kind of self-regulation part of it. Through Saving Brains, we funded the Kangaroo Foundation in Colombia, who conducted the first randomized control study comparing kangaroo care with incubator care in preterm babies and low birth weight babies. And we funded them to go find those same participants. So this study was done 18, 20 years ago now 21 years ago. And so they found the participants when they were aged 18 to 20, and we're figuring out how they fared after this. And so this study, which was published in Pediatrics in 2016 in December, demonstrated that KMC, compared to that incubator care, actually had significant long-lasting social and behavioral protective effects on those babies 20 years after the intervention. So important things they saw were essentially improvements in behaviors, in brain size, in school attendance, and in wages compared to, and that's for the kids who received kangaroo mother care versus their peers who were also born preterm and low birth weight but received incubator care. And really interestingly, these actually acted through the changes in family dynamics. So seeing that the families who had actually provided that kangaroo care, and it's a fairly intensive thing to keep a baby. I don't know if people have had a newborn, it's needy to begin with, but then the fact that you're actually trying to keep it at your skin the entire time. This is a big investment that these families are making. But they're actually, those families who were able to do this were more likely to be putting their kids in preschool in their early years, and also were more likely to be together. Like the family unit was more likely to be together 20 years later. So imagine this power of actually having an intervention that happens in that first year of life that not only sets up a child initially for their health and development, but also actually strengthens the family in a way that then can support that development throughout the life course. So then, of course, the big challenge is, how do we make sure every child who needs it gets kangaroo mother care? And this, of course, is the crux of all of, I think, what we're dealing with in early child development. We do know a lot about what can work and what can have these positive influences, and what's really kind of stumping us at the moment is how do you get it out there? So scaling kangaroo mother care really does require a fundamental change in how preterm birth and low birth weight babies are cared for. And it's really moving people away from what is perceived as a gold standard of a highly technological kind of neonatal ICU setup that many developing countries are still trying to mimic from high-income countries. And there certainly is a place for this. Don't quote me as saying, like, I want to get rid of NICUs. There's a place for this, but there's also a place for thinking about when we can be using kangaroo mother care a little bit more deliberately. The Kangaroo Foundation, so the same Columbia Foundation, has been very successful in actually training teams around the world. Usually these are healthcare providers, nurses, pediatricians, doctors, social workers, and they've trained about 60 institution teams from about 40 different countries over the last 20 years. And these centers of excellence are really good at providing KMC, quality KMC, but they've never been successful to kind of disseminate it beyond their one institution. And often even when key people leave that were trained in that institution, the practice goes away. So that was the challenge, the kind of next challenge we were focused on with Kangaroo Foundation. And so we supported them and a newly formed Kangaroo Foundation Cameroon to develop an institutional version of a train-the-trainer model that was supported by an e-learning platform. And this was meant to disseminate KMC from those centers of excellence down to regional and district hospitals so that you can be getting kind of institutional awareness and training of these different, care workers in quality KMC. And in parallel, getting at this point of how hard it is to actually tap into the private sector and some other sources of capital for scaling up these things, we've been designing a development impact bond, which is essentially an innovative financial structure that allows socially minded private investors to fund the transition of kangaroo mother care, in this case, across Cameroon. And they're paid back with a bit of interest by the funder, which in this case is the government of Cameroon, who is backed by the Global Financing Facility at the World Bank, by GCC and by some others that I can't announce yet, but I'm looking forward to soon. And they're only paid if and when those key health outcomes are actually achieved. So it's a pay-on-results model. And we're expecting to launch this development impact bond in the late summer, early autumn this year. And in Cameroon alone, we think that this approach actually has the potential to reach about 105,000 fragile newborns with quality KMC by 2030. And so we're hopeful that this also provides a bit of a financial and kind of implementation model for how to take a country that has a strong starting point and needs to disseminate this practice throughout. So we're at the start of a second year of funding, a second 5-year chunk of funding that we're thrilled to have received from Global Affairs, and we're really looking forward to continuing our work under Saving Brains on this. We're really focused on trying to crack some of the scaling part of the challenge that's ahead, but we still are sourcing strategically some new innovations, and we will have a call for proposals out for new innovations in a couple months' time, so please pay attention to that. If you've got good ideas you want to test out, we would love to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly. Kofi, talk to us a bit about things from the perspective of a new institution in the developing world, focused on this issue in the developing world. One of the areas that we've been talking a lot about is integration across all the different elements and sectors that have traditionally owned the delivery vehicles and owned, frankly, the vocabulary around this issue. What are the issues from where you sit at the Aga Khan University Institute for Human Development in Nairobi? Kofi.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this. I was going to say that telling Kofi Mafu to be short is neglecting the reality that the only way I compensate for my height is by talking for a long time. The good news is that I see you haven't monitored anybody, so I assume you will not be monitored. So I'm really delighted. Part of my task is to also institutionally talk about what is happening within the Aga Khan Development Network, which you all know it's probably one of the world's foremost, probably biggest development assistance agencies that does a lot of work in many countries, probably about 30 countries or so. And in the area of early childhood development alone, we are in about 23 countries where we could actually talk about early childhood intervention programs that have had elements of integration or are beginning to beef up, integration as an approach to child development interventions, especially as a result of newer research and the kinds of recommendations that are coming out of the Lancet series. So part of what I'll try to do is to paint a picture of where AKDN is. In the process, I also make editorial comments probably about what are some of the challenging issues that we still face. I'm not going to have time to look at the notion of integration under a microscope, but I think part of what we need to do as researchers and as interveners is to always sit back and pose the question, what do we mean by that, and what are the multiple dimensions of it. But because in part I realize and I see now that I live in Africa and really see the issues on a day-to-day basis, I want to couch my sharing of what is happening in AKDN in the global context, but also more specifically in the Canadian context. Because the story of AKDN's work in early childhood development is actually a story of enablement by bilateral, multilateral relationships. And in our sphere of work, the Canadian government is one of the biggest sources of support, whether you think about it in terms of fiscal investments, in the regions of the world that most of us like to call developing countries, and I like to call the majority world because that's where the largest population of people are. And if you take a look from that angle, you don't have to worry about whether we are north-south or we are least developing or less developing. But on a serious note, I think the Canadian government plays such a huge role. And our partnerships, in the short time that I've been with AKDN, specifically with the university and as head of the Institute for Human Development, is just remarkable, how enabling, our Canadian sources actually has been. And my hope is that as we look at these issues, we'll continue to think about how we continue to build those relationships with governmental agencies. We're very well supported by, Canadian governmental agencies. Currently, we have a grant, from AKFC and RDRC that is enabling us to really look at marginalized communities, where you have a combination of native Kenyans and refugees who've been displaced from their countries. And how do we try to understand the dynamics of child development in those contexts? And how can we, out of intimate understandings of what happens in those communities, not just pulling methodologies of our research bags, but actually going into the communities and understanding what the needs are, how do we put in place a basket of interventions that delivered sort of integratively might shape the developmental trajectories of children from birth on to about 3. Now, this is a beginning effort. The study is now just beginning, and the hope is that we'll be able to sort of have the benefit of counting on agencies to build that study beyond the 3 years and be able to sort of follow these kids into the future. Because as it turns out, one of the challenges with early intervention, the whole notion of early intervention, and I think Zulfi was referring to this, is somehow we get sidetracked into putting all our eggs in one basket. And it's almost like we come up with this inoculation model. If you did a wonderful stuff in the early years, maybe you don't have to do anything and children will be good. Well, it doesn't happen that way. So part of our challenge is how do we sow the wonderful seed? I'm reminded of the Confucian proverb or statement that said, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. But the next best time is now. That is the case, but actually we can plant it now, but we can't forget that we have to nurture it over time. And this is where I think one of the significant advances in maternal and child health, in developmental science, in all the disciplines that actually contribute to understandings of human development, is this emerging notion that we need to first integrate our knowledge and understandings across disciplines. So when I look at integration, and I like to look at it at multiple levels. The first level is how do we bring the lines of inquiry that in many ways sit in silos together to give us a solid understanding of interventions such that integrated interventions will be a natural effect, not something that you pull for. Because part of what is the challenge is that most of us are working in interventions in specific areas. Now we're trying to bring them together. But you can't do that until you get people talking across disciplines and understanding what has been successful, what has been problematic, and how do we overcome those. So from a policy advocacy perspective, I think we do really have a challenge, and part of the challenge in the majority world is actually not just how do we prepare people to be ready for the kinds of work that needs to be done. Not just how we fund those programs, but actually how we also redefine our own understandings of what it takes to make a difference in children's lives. I will take the perspective of our approach, the issue of where AKDN is in terms of integrated early childhood intervention by looking at it at 3 levels. The first is what I call the knowledge delivery level. And one of the things happening within AKDN is we've become a major force for the development of knowledge on the science of early child development. There is a lot of science out there. There is a lot of advocacy when you look at the advances in international contributions to child development. We've done a lot helping nations to develop policies for children. We've done a lot of advocacy. We actually are either importing programs or helping communities to develop programs. So we're doing well on the programmatic end, on the policy end. We're not doing well on the knowledge end. It's almost as if we assume that if you have policies and you have advocacy and you have programs, everything will be fine. No, everything will not be fine. I think knowledge is very important, and how to understand the context in which you develop and deliver that knowledge is very, very critical. So the science of early child development, which actually began right here in Canada at Red River College. Over the years, we formed relationship with the University of Toronto. Our colleague, Steve, is here. Actually created a relationship in which the course has been taught by the 2 universities, Aga Khan University and University of Toronto. But now we are in communities and through programs like what's made possible by the Hilton Foundation, actually delivering courses in multiple formats to professionals at multiple levels on what our understandings of child development is, beginning from the brain developmental perspective all the way to the ecological perspectives, to the social determinants of health and what implications they have for understanding children's development. That's a significant, I think, contribution that AKDN makes that is probably very, very unique, throughout the world. The second piece is the Care for Child Development Package, which was developed by UNICEF in collaboration with the World Health Organization. And now AKD and agencies are actually the principal drivers of training for professionals who train the frontline workers, health workers who actually implement the Care for Child Development intervention, in multiple communities around our part of the world. So there are multiple examples. I use those as two strong indicators of the role of AKDN in getting the knowledge out there, in effect, shaping workforce development to ensure that our policies and our programs actually have a chance of surviving and thriving. The second area is the actual programming, for young children. And there I would talk about just two issues. One of the things about AKDN is it also prides itself as a learning organization. I've been impressed by how much emphasis is put on how can we understand what we've been doing over the past 10 years? What do we know to be the impact, and what can we learn from it? You have to be the first beneficiary of your own research to be able to use that research to benefit others. And I think as a result of that orientation, we are constantly looking at how anew might we do our work. And one of the strongest strategic sort of positions that AKF has taken is that over the next 5 to 10 years, we need to really look seriously about how we integrate interventions, utilizing everything we know across the multiple domains of human development, health, education, social protection, nutrition, and what have you. There is also an initiative which probably has not gotten a lot of attention, but Reading for Children, which is an initiative that tries to support parents and other caregivers in the child's environment to introduce them to reading by reading to them and by telling stories in their own native language as a way of cultivating the sort of the context in which children come to understand the reading process. I have to share this story, although it's getting long, but one of the things we invariably do very often, there was a study that was based on data gathered by UNICEF, the Mixed 3 data set. And I use this as an example because in the analysis, the authors were looking at whether children are read to or not and what implications that have for their development. And when they looked at 6 maternal behavioral areas, reading was one of them, the least occurring was reading to children, about 29% by mothers, 19% by fathers. And of course, part of the initial conclusion until the revision process began as a function of the recommendation from the reviewers was that these kids are at risk. Now, it underscores one of the limitations of really trying to do international work. Well, it turns out the question was asking mothers, how many times have you read to your child within the last week? For many of these environments, a mother would be the last person to be reading to the child. Right? I mean, many of these mothers are themselves not school educated. Now, if you had just twisted the question slightly, does anybody read to your child? Who is that person? How many times does a person read to a child in a week? The result could have been very different. I mean, it looks so petty, but actually, fundamentally, if you were to go back 10 years after that study, you use the first study as the baseline, and you're trying to look at the potential predictability of outcomes 10 years later from that data set, you'll be dead wrong because you did not measure reading to children in the way that is contextually, makes sense. The last area is the area of what I call our role within AKDN as both thought leaders and as an organization that tries to sort of push the limits of research. Now, in the area of thought leaders, I cannot talk of what we really have done in terms of the developing trend towards integration. I'll leave that for the research. But I think what you're going to see happen as a result of what is happening within the Institute for Human Development, what is happening in the Center of Excellence for Women's Health and Women's and Children's Health, what is happening as a result of thematic research groups that are emerging, will be that we will be looking at the whole notion of integration from multiple perspectives. We'll be shaping a new arena of research where we are increasingly bringing the disciplines together and looking at cross-cutting concepts and ideas that have implications for actually shaping programs within community environments. And finally, the research piece, and I will mention just maybe two examples. One example is, oh, just one, okay. Right for that one. Okay. So if I had to take one, probably I'll go back to the study that is that we're now launching, in Nairobi, in what we call informal settlements. And I think that is one area where we're beginning to look at how we actually utilize our understandings of integrated, interventions and put them into community settings so we can evaluate them over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kofi. So from around the world and back home down to Toronto, Catherine, tell us a bit about, effectively Canada's premier research institute looking at kind of children, at sick kids in Toronto. Tell us a bit about how this all plays out in your neck of the woods.
So thank you. I'm honored to be here. We've heard a lot about low and middle income countries. What we haven't heard as much about is the fact that there are major gaps in the evidence for early childhood development, even in Canada. So there's basically zero surveillance of children's health and development from 0 to 3 in this country in our national studies. As an example, there's actually very limited interventions that have been tested for early childhood development in Canada. But I'm here to tell you that there are enormous opportunities in some of the settings that we work in, for example, in the community healthcare setting. So I'm going to give you one example of work that I'm co-leading in Toronto with a practice-based research network called Target Kids. And here we really leverage the fact that children within the first few years of life attend their physician's offices at least 15 times. And when they do attend their physician offices for their preventative health care visits, they are engaged around their health. That's why they're bringing their children there. The relationship between primary health care and parents is a very trusted relationship. And yet we haven't really used the opportunity of these multiple visits to understand more about early childhood development and also to intervene. So we've created a practice-based research network, largely in the GTA and now in Quebec, where we have 12 large group practices. We've essentially embedded a research team member into each of these practices. So when parents bring their young children in, they're asked to participate. And participation means telling a little bit about their child's health, their learning, their development, their temperament, and their parenting, and also to follow these children every single time they come back. So we've now essentially created a cohort of over 8,500 children where we see them again and again and again. And we can measure these trajectories in their growth and in their development and in the parents' health and the parents' development. This has been a really incredible opportunity to develop this platform. So now that we have this platform where we're looking at children's health and family health over time, we can actually layer on and test interventions. We have the research assistants sitting in the practices. We can test interventions, and then we can use the results of those interventions to inform future interventions. So we talked a lot today actually about integration. So we're involving healthcare professionals, researchers, doctors, nurses, but also dietitians, also physical activity. We haven't talked a lot about physical activity today. Physical activity, early childhood development, practitioners, behavioralists, and now school. So we did hear a little bit about the EDI. As our children get older, we're actually able to now prospectively collect data on their school readiness. So the collaboration is between the researchers and the practitioners. And the last year or so, we've really focused on collaborating with parents. So we've brought parents in together to ask them the question, what is your priority? What are the unanswered research questions from your perspective? And we recently just published that paper, and we're using that as a guide to really, over the next few years, of what we should really focus on. So our methods are multiple longitudinal prospective data collection on children in their community healthcare practices. And now we can actually link to other existing resources. So we have very rich health administration data on these children. So how often do they go to the doctor? How often do they go to the emergency departments? How are they accessing mental health services? We also are collecting data on moms during pregnancy and inviting those moms to participate in Target Kids. So that allows us a longitudinal cohort of pregnancy. We're connecting to school data, as I mentioned, the EDI we talked about this morning. In Canada, we collect the EDI so we can actually look at their school outcomes and hopefully their future health outcomes as they go into grade 6 and grade 3 and grade 6. And then finally, we're running trials. So we've run several nutrition trials looking at the treatment of non-anemic iron deficiency, looking at vitamin D dosing. We're now really excited about a trial looking at parenting interventions and the outcomes and home visiting. So trying to use some of actually the models that are quite well developed and well studied in the low and middle income world, and then actually bringing them into our Canadian context. We have a vast public health system that is enmeshed in home visits and nutritional work, and we've got a vast healthcare system, primary healthcare system, but the two don't relate. So part of our work, and there's a call from the Ontario government and nationally to integrate some of our work. So that's an example of integration we're really excited about. So I just wanted to end just really presenting this idea as a platform that we could scale up across the province and across the country, and we could have an opportunity in our existing healthcare system and public health care system to actually test iteratively these interventions and use our evidence that we're developing in concert with stakeholders and parents and practitioners to really improve early childhood health. And the added benefit is then we would have a actually functioning surveillance system that now, as you know, doesn't exist in the early childhood, that would look at both health and development and education, all the way from biological factors all the way down to behaviors. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and to all of you for giving us these 5 kind of vantage points on the issues at stake, both globally and around the world, both around the world and at home in Canada. And I think, Catherine, what a nice note to conclude on, highlighting the relationship between what we're learning in one part of the world and its relationship back home, and vice versa. Many of you will know that the Sustainable Development Goals, at least in principle, are meant to be universal. They're not meant to be an agenda for the majority world alone. They're meant to be an agenda for the entire world. And early childhood may well be one of those places where we can see the universality of the SDGs coming to fore most quickly and easily. We've got some time for comments or questions on issues you may want to pursue. And I want to start with Kelly Stone, who's been thinking about all this from her vantage point. What have you heard here now that kind of gives you some idea for what the relationship of all of this is to the actual practical work on the ground that you're confronting? And if not, what do you need to hear next?
I mean, these things have to be obviously a partnership, and we do have really good partnerships. So in a sense, it was kind of an unfair question at the beginning, because obviously we do work with some of the folks that are here today. But some of the areas that we can really focus in on and sort of very practically are social communications, taking advantage. I mean, I have to live in a digital world, because when I'm dealing with so many people across the country, I'm not out, having conversations with all of them. We have to be very digital. So social communications, key messages, we're always pumping out stuff to our service providers, to our families. We can make that more targeted and less sort of random. We can, we can populate it. Yes, key messages and repetitive, not the same message, but the same concept over and over again in a very deliberate way. E-learning, both primarily for service providers and professional development. We will come this summer, as others will, have an opportunity to do some serious e-learning using our website. Well, this kind of information can be put into packages for service providers, so we again inform them of the most recent information and what they can be potentially a part of, and they can give us voices from the field. Videos, we're moving more and more into video libraries along with colleagues that are animated to deal with tough subjects in a very animated, short, very professional way, that maybe have tip sheets that go with them for discussions between service providers and families. that can be adapted to a whole variety of languages and cultures quite easily when you do it that way. So that's something that would allow some of the translation of Dr. Lai's information down right to the coalface again. And maybe together we can be working to invite the private sector into this. So we're taking the sort of science side and the practical, the service provider side, and saying together we now need the private sector, government aside for the moment, but we really need to include somebody else in, because not only is it a social responsibility thing and workforce productivity now, but it's their human capital for the future.
Well, thank you, Kelly. It's a really important kind of agenda of practical applications from kind of the knowledge demanders side about what all this means for people in practice. I've got Zulfi here.
So I had a companion question which relates to what investments need to be made. And I'd like to ask the panel if they have any thoughts in relation to what we should be doing for our education, medical education and training programs. We didn't do so effectively within the MDGs for many of the issues around maternal and child health in global context. We are struggling with that in our global health programs, even in North America today. So is there a way, without creating a north-south divide, of having a universal kind of a core curriculum on health and development that we could not only use for undergraduates, but also within our pediatric and other relevant training programs?
Do you have thoughts on this? And I'm going to expand the question to be an integrationist. Pick your profession that you think is relevant. What are the implications for educating the multitude of workforces associated with this agenda? Zulfi's asked about medical curricula and continuing medical education. You could ask about other professions. Who wants to take a cut at this? Kofi.
I think at one level, probably the easiest part is really to think of interdisciplinarity in our training, where we tie together much of what we know about human development across the various disciplines. The other is something that I think, was it you who pointed out, the bidirectionality of knowledge. I mean, we're used to providing help and education and science to the rest of the world. We're not good at taking back. And I think most of the things we do in other parts of the world have implications, for us here. And so understanding how to build the wonderful work that is being done in other parts of the world and the changes we are making in the quality of life and sort of cycling them into our own educational programs, I think is very important, such that you don't have to be a specialist in the developing countries to be able to understand the needs of children in other parts of the world. Well, at least those are two dimensions. But
other thoughts on this? Shuli.
I think we may have to fundamentally rethink some of our concepts of training. I think interdisciplinarity is one of those things. But some of our scientific concepts need to be rethought as well. In our concepts of science, we tend to be very reductionist in the way we think. And I'm not sure that that way of thinking necessarily lends itself very well to some of the real-world problems that we see. We may have to be a bit more holistic in the way we think about issues and how do we deal with them. Another problem is that we tend to be, in a way we go about doing our work, we tend not to think about implementation. We tend to think about causation, etc., in a very fixed way, and we train people in that way. So when it comes to the implementation side of things, implementation science is actually not very well developed, and it's another area that I think we have to rethink how we do that. The third area, I think, is that we have developed very different schools of thought. So we have people in the administration of health services and education services and social services, etc. We've got people in the research, we've got people in the medical area, and they don't actually link up very well. They tend to be very siloed. And how do we actually make sure that these different folks that trying to discover research from implementation and delivery of services actually are able to interact in a meaningful way is something that we have to rethink as well. So I think there are multiple dimensions on which we need to rethink some of these things. Another common mistake is that people often think of the flow of information and knowledge as being from the developed world to the developing world. And that's not always true. In fact, very many things are socially and contextually relevant. And kangaroo care that Carol Lee talked about earlier, something that came from Colombia. It's not something we invented in North America or Europe or anywhere else. So I think some of those concepts that we have in the past really need to be rethought. And it isn't clear to me that the education system and training systems that we have in place currently in the university-based and college-based is necessarily the right way to go. There are many instances where in Pakistan or India, etc., people are using village workers and so on at a ground level. And so I think some rethinking about some of these concepts may be necessary if we're actually going to move the field forward.
Yeah, I just have 3 examples of this that I think has been awesome to think about. First is the Palix Foundation has done an awesome job in Alberta, essentially pulling together kind of mid to high level management across different services that make up Alberta services, and essentially immerse them in the core story of brain development, and so that each of them is now understanding where their service links into actually helping a child thrive. And they've done some phenomenal stuff throughout that province that I think is a good example of how we can maybe think about maybe continuing education on these types of things. Second, I think I'm a pretty firm believer on generally like needing to have the general public aware of this. And one of the more brilliant ones, if anyone's a fan of Orange is the New Black, it's a Netflix series, but they did a fabulous plot line where they were essentially had the whole talk to your baby plot line really seamlessly put into the storyline in a way that was really obvious. And you're like, oh my goodness, you are talking about how important it is to talk to your baby in a very like Hollywood thing. And I think that kind of thing we should think about how to do more and more. And then finally on the private sector thing, it's come up a few times. There's a woman called Sarah Watson who's really trying to do this Ready Nation thing around the world. She's done a phenomenal job in the US, in Uganda, and I'm blanking somewhere else in Europe, I think. She's desperate to help us do this in Canada. I haven't had the bandwidth to help do that, but if there's someone else who's really keen to essentially, and her thing is to unlock the power of CEOs in Canada to talk about this kind of invest in the workforce for kind of future years, I'd be very happy to make the link because she'd be thrilled to help with us.
Thanks, Carly. Stephen, do you want to have a view on this professional education?
One point that was raised in the Canadian context about sharing material digitally. There's also, frankly, increasingly ubiquitous ways to use social communications to crowdsource and actually drive community mobilization for change. There are lots of ways to actually have communities highlight the fact that they're not getting services. And that these services are really hurting them, and actually have that be a cry at the national level to mobilize political support for their efforts. We've been doing this with a range of different social problems. Crowdsourcing and geotagging that and showing where the problems are actually located, the specific locations, and then using that information to go into the communities physically and actually begin to mobilize groups in those communities to try to address these problems that people in your community are raising in larger numbers than in other communities. And that comparison is a very powerful lever for change. And that's now quite ubiquitous. These applications, which 7 years ago, Grand Challenges family would pay $100,000 for these kinds of challenges, you can get these apps now for $3,000 in any fair in Hyderabad in India. They're chock-a-block. These kinds of applications. So I think that's changing, the ability to then use those to mobilize communities more broadly. I think that's a real opportunity.
Catherine, you sit at a hospital. Any kind of view on this issue of professional development for all the professionals you have to deal with every day?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be integrated. I mean, essentially, you can't have different specialties saying different things to families. And I think a lot of that creativity, I think, is actually moving beyond the walls of the hospital into the community and out from traditionally what's considered health when you're thinking about children. So it's thinking about community, thinking about nutrition, thinking about policy, thinking about parents and families, thinking about the workplace. I think that's where you're going to get the true innovation, not staying within your medical field.
Thank you.
Jane. Hi, I'm Jan Sanderson, Red River College, Winnipeg, and I'm the research chair. I just wanted to add to the conversation, there's actually a bunch of things, but that we also think about even more unusual academic professionals when we think about integration. So public administration schools, as an example, and the MBA students, and the social work students and faculty, and involving them. Because if we're going to change the platforms and create greater integration, we need those people involved as well. And I saw the Chile example and thought it was very interesting because ultimately the government legislated that to happen, and it would be great if we could unpackage the case study behind the scenes about what happened to had to happen in a public administration perspective to make that happen. So that's just a thought.
The Institute of Medicine Investing in Young Children Globally, I think, did a big case study on that, and if not, it was Bernard Van Leer Foundation. Both of them have looked at it.
Understood the political commitment that allowed this whole thing to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. There's one issue that you haven't talked about enough, I think, before we move to a conclusion, which is scale. One of the issues of the report, the Lancet series talks about, is the quantum of the issue, the number of children that need to be reached. We haven't yet found a way, I think as Dominic said here, even on some of the single interventions to get to scale. We're being asked now by the series to look at these bundle of interventions and get those to scale. What parts of your institutional programs are going to help us get over this hump? Where are we on this? What do we need to do? Carly, you're nodding the most, so you get the...
I think it is a massive challenge. So I think it isn't the single intervention type of play that we're going off of here. And I think the challenge that was also well articulated in the series was the fact that there's multiple entry points within different contexts that we have to pay attention to. In terms of, so I don't have answers. I have some promising things in our pipeline that we're essentially going to be reinvesting in the coming 3 years or so to really, and with a really deliberate focus on how do we take those, not only to try and get them to scale, but also to learn what is working a little bit more. I would say that there's an element of this where even just understanding when we talk about the nurturing care, and I think this is again something that the series has done very well, but that if we can embed that into all of the research we do and dissemination of the studies that we're doing, is to really unpack what we mean by parent coaching or things like this down to a level of detail, so that when people read it, they get the same level of clarity as they are like, this is a dosing regime for iron and folic acid for pregnant women. We understand kind of what are those active ingredients, because the more, not totally reductionist, but the more reductions we get to those active ingredients, the more likely we are to get those packages that actually are well suited to each context. So a few thoughts, stay tuned, and I would love anyone to help with this endeavor as we go forward.
Kofi, you have a view sitting kind of in Nairobi, you can see firsthand the scale of the issue. How are we going to deal with this?
Well, actually, I think from my perspective, there are two ways to think about this, because I think sometimes we lump together what research does for us, right? That is research, quad research. When we do these wonderful designs, they are aimed at testing ideas. And then the issue is, how do you take the ideas that have been tested, interventions, to the rest of society? So our experimental work is very, very critical. But I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that every time we demonstrate the effectiveness of an intervention model, we are shaping educational systems and social services. So a lot of what takes place in community at large is not some direct sort of scaling up of a program that we all want to see. It's what I call the ripple effect, that research sort of has. So if you look at early interventions in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, the field of intervention has changed drastically, but they are not necessarily through formal transplantations of what we've learned from research. It's the infiltration into social services of what we've been able to demonstrate through science. Right? And we need to bear those two things in mind.
Great. Any other thoughts on scale? Yeah, Stephen, you've seen this in a few other instances.
Experimenting with efforts across sub-Saharan Africa to combine implementation research with actual interventions based on that research, and then to try to get key policy brokers to actually take the results of that combined research and intervention, which are very practical pieces of research. They're not bench science, to other governments at a national level. I would say that, so in East Africa, we've been working with APHRC, for example, as one of the policy brokers, and in West Africa with the West African Health Organization. And I would say that there's something to this as an approach. Not in every case. Capacities have to be built, not just to do the implementation research, not just to understand the actual tested intervention, but then to link up the groups doing the implementation work with policy brokers who are different again. But there appear to be some results from this approach.
Zulfi, for a final thought on this matter.
I actually, I wanted to address the question that Dominic posed. Can't see him where he is.
He's I think, left.
Yeah.
In anticipation of your rebut.
Yeah, so it wasn't a rebut, it was to offer an opportunity. So, you know, I think one of the bottlenecks that we get in scaling up some of the health interventions emerge when we are not able to do enough around demand creation, getting people behind things that we do. And some of these new emerging interventions that have to do with not just survival, but long-term outcomes, you know, future perspectives, have enormous value and power in terms of even impacting on health sector intervention. Now, we've seen that within cash transfer programs. We've seen that within women's groups. Now, women's groups, for example, in South Asia, as they've been used, and in a few places in Africa, have very little to do with health. I mean, they are just opportunities for women to get together and to have empowerment. And their effect on many of the health sector interventions, as you know, is phenomenal. But can they be used for scaling up other things? We haven't yet tested those waters. I can just leave you with one final factoid, which is the fastest growth in Pakistan within the health sector is in the growth of preschool education systems in rural districts, in small towns, and almost entirely within the private sector. Now, they're not expensive schools. They are community-based initiatives around innovations. Now, how did that emerge? That emerged about society's awareness of the value of that early element of education and strengthening. It is not getting kids out of your hands. It is getting kids better prepared in some way for what they need to deal with primary education per se. Now, those kind of opportunities also offer you great platforms for scaling up immunizations, scaling up nutrition interventions, you know, reducing gender disparities. So we just haven't looked at that in terms of the bilateral linkages of the two.
Unleashing kind of the power of grassroots civil society to take some of this stuff on and just attack it on their own steam because they think it's important and realize it's important. And what's the policy framework that allows that to happen? What a lovely and inspiring note to end this session on. Thank you to all of our panelists for indulging my muscular moderation, or maybe not so muscular, and for your different vantage points on this important issue, showing how there are a whole series of ways in which the insights embedded in the series can kind of be elaborated in a lot of different contexts. 5 here, many, many more in the audience. So thank you very much. That brings us, ladies and gentlemen, to our final and concluding session of what has been a really extraordinarily rich day of dialogue. I am really delighted that we have with us here the Honorable Jean-Yves Duclos, who is the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development. The Minister's bio in detail is included in your materials, so I won't consume the valuable time it would take me now to recite it all. Suffice it to say that the Minister is himself a scholar of the most distinguished standing in this country, an economist by profession who has been involved in policy issues around poverty for decades. And so it's not such an unnatural thing that he has taken the leap into public service of a different kind as an elected official and has been immediately entrusted by the Prime Minister with the portfolio in the cabinet. I think it's notable that this portfolio is at least a newly named portfolio, but I think it suggests a different kind of aspiration for the government's relationship to the whole question of support to children and families at this important time in our country's development and in the midst of very, very challenging economic and social forces of change. Minister, we've spent the day and the afternoon looking at the most recent evidence base that has come from the Lancet series on early childhood development. We have looked at the global and the local linkages. That is to say, the challenges and the promise ahead of us here in Canada, as well as the promise and the challenges ahead of us in the world. And just now, I think we have reminded ourselves that the Sustainable Development Goals are meant to be a universal agenda. They're not meant to be an agenda simply for the majority world or for the low-income world. They're meant to be a vision for a successful society anywhere in the world. And it may well be that in early childhood development, we find one of the most important and convenient platforms where we might be able to animate and realize the universal potential of the Sustainable Development Goals, where in actualizing our aspirations here at home, we may actually also be actualizing an important aspiration for the world. It's a great delight for us to have Minister Yu with us to conclude our session, and I'll invite you now to join me in welcoming Minister Jean-Yves Duclos to the stage. Minister Duclos.
Bonjour à tous. Je tiens tout d'abord à souligner que nous sommes sur le territoire traditionnel des peuples algonquins. J'aimerais aussi remercier la Fondation Aga Khan et l'Alliance pour le développement humain de m'avoir invité à me joindre à vous aujourd'hui. Permettez-moi de vous féliciter pour le travail de grande importance que vous accomplissez pour nos enfants et pour nos familles. Vous croyez en la recherche et vous mettez la recherche au profit du développement des enfants. Et grâce à vous, plusieurs pays ont maintenant de meilleures connaissances pour mieux développer le potentiel de leurs enfants et de nos enfants. Helping children reach their potential. That's why we are here together. It is our shared mission and it is our shared passion. We know that meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goal is only possible outside of this country and in Canada if we invest in all of our children. I speak to you this afternoon as a proud father of 3 wonderful children, and I am also the federal minister in charge of an ambitious program of early learning and childcare. Our government, and you do as well, understands that investments in children are smart investments. To quote the great Frederick Douglass, a heroic American from the 19th century, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken adults. And for that reason, this symposium looks at the development of our children. Il ne s'agit évidemment pas d'une mince affaire. Nous parlons à la fois de notre avenir et de celui de notre humanité. Le but du gouvernement canadien est de donner à chaque Canadien une chance réelle et juste de réussir. Cela demande évidemment que le bien-être et l'essor des familles canadiennes soient au cœur des priorités de ce gouvernement. And for that reason, I would like to talk to you today about what, specifically, our government is doing to help children and families reach their full potential. As I was saying before I entered this room, I would also have liked to talk about the developing world and the importance of investments in that other context. Unfortunately, my earlier life is now past, and I must focus, at least according to my boss's will, I must focus on my mandate letter, and therefore we'll speak specifically about what we're doing here in Canada to advance early learning and childcare and child welfare. I will focus in that context on 4 parts of our plan. First, historic investments in early learning and childcare. Second, more direct and more equitable financial support for families with children. Third, better employment insurance support for mothers and fathers. And fourth, more flexible work arrangements. Let me start with early learning and childcare. The evidence is clear. Quality early learning and childcare has a positive impact on child development, particularly for vulnerable children. In fact, the evidence is more than clear. It is overwhelming, as the Lancet papers being discussed today at this symposium amply demonstrate. Nous avons donc une responsabilité collective d'intervenir tôt pour favoriser le développement des enfants depuis la période prénatale et durant la petite enfance, parce que nous savons que ça marche, particulièrement pour les enfants les plus vulnérables, et aussi parce que ces interventions permettent de réduire les besoins et les coûts en éducation spécialisée, en santé et en services sociaux, tout en augmentant le niveau de préparation des enfants pour entrer à l'école. Unfortunately, however, too many Canadian families are struggling to get access to quality childcare. Childcare is much more than some place where parents drop off their children and forget about them during the workday. Quality childcare is, first and foremost, about the education of our children. It is about the cognitive, physical, and social development of our children. When quality childcare is affordable, it also means that more women are more likely to find work, stay employed, and develop careers. In fact, taking gender equality seriously means taking childcare seriously. Thousands more parents working and generating incomes also means a decrease in poverty, which is another key objective of our government. These are all important reasons why this year's, last March, budget is investing an additional $7 billion over 10 years to support and create more high-quality, affordable childcare spaces across the country. We will focus in that context most on the most vulnerable children, including Canada's Indigenous children. Over the next 3 years, we therefore expect to support up to 40,000 new subsidized childcare spaces for low and modest income families. We also understand, and you certainly understand, that better data leads to better outcomes, which is why we are investing millions and will be investing millions to close data gaps in understanding what childcare looks like in Canada and to track progress. And if I may open a parenthesis, I would suggest that generating better data is good for many different reasons. First, good to understand better how the system works now. Second, to understand better how the system could work better. Third, to let Canadians, and skeptical Canadians in particular, and there are many of them, that investment in early learning and childcare makes a difference. And fourth, to have an inclusive and effective conversation with provinces and territories, which, in the context of a federation like Canada, have most of the responsibilities in delivering the actual early learning and childcare services in Canada. However, in that context, and I'm still in my parenthesis, in my context, let me say and acknowledge, and many of you will know that and understand that in a federation there is often a normal tendency for governments to create walls, for some governments to focus on some things and other governments to focus on other things. I believe that in early learning and childcare investments, the federal government also has a responsibility to spread innovative techniques and innovative agendas so that we can, and when I say we here, it's provinces and territories, we can build on the emulation that is possible in a wide federation like Canada. I am therefore currently working with provinces and territories on a framework on early learning and childcare as a way to reach broad agreement on basic principles. We will also be co-developing, and co-developing is a key word here, a distinct Indigenous framework on early learning and childcare in cooperation with Indigenous partners to reflect the unique cultures and needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children across Canada. Now, if you would allow, I would like to talk to you about the Canada Child Benefit, which is Canada's most significant social policy innovation in a generation. The Canada Child Benefit gives families more resources, more money to help with the cost of raising kids. It is simpler, tax-free, and better targeted to those who need it most. It is also much more generous, and millionaires no longer receive checks that they do not need and that they do not expect. 9 out of 10 Canadian families are now receiving an average of $2,300 more in non-taxable child benefits per year compared with the previous complicated and unfair system. This is reducing child poverty by 40% and will lead to the lowest level of child poverty in the history of our nation. I would also like to say a few words on employment insurance benefits for parents and mothers. Parental benefits and maternity benefits help parents balance work and time with their children. Of course, every family situation is different, so we are making changes to improve flexibility for more parents. EI, employment insurance parental benefits, will allow parents to extend benefits over 18 months beyond the current period of 12 months. Expectant mothers will also be able to claim maternity benefits a month earlier, up to 12 weeks before the due date. And we have also improved caregiving benefits, which will provide additional support to parents caring for sick children. On that same theme of flexibility, I want to raise the fourth and final policy we are implementing to support children and families. Giving more flexibility to working parents is a clear way to support the development of their children. Parents need work schedules that are flexible enough and modern enough so that they can drop off their kids at school and pick them up from hockey practice. Sometimes parents also need to work from home when their kids come down with a fever. Many of us have been there, but not all employers are always very accommodating. And that is why we are amending the Canada Labour Code to help employees balance work and family responsibilities. Amendments to the Canada Labour Code will ensure that federally regulated employees have the right to request flexible work arrangements, such as flexible start and finish times, as well as the ability to work from home. The amendments will also provide employees with new unpaid leaves for family responsibilities, to participate in traditional Indigenous practices, and to seek care if they are victims of family violence, and to make bereavement leave more flexible. Now, you've heard the key elements of our record thus far on helping families. We are investing more and better in early learning and childcare. We are providing more support to families with children. We are improving employment insurance benefits for mothers and fathers, and we are increasing flexible work arrangements. I'm very proud of this record, but there is much more to do as we engage on a long-term plan to grow the middle class, help more Canadians join it, and leave no child behind. En terminant, j'aimerais vous dire à quel point il est inspirant de voir des gens comme vous, venant de milieux différents, réunis pour trouver des solutions novatrices pour mieux soutenir le développement de nos enfants. Nous partageons tous le même souhait, donner à tous les enfants une chance équitable et réelle de grandir et de s'épanouir. Et pour citer le grand Nelson Mandela, il ne peut y avoir plus vive révélation de l'âme d'une société que la manière dont elle traite ses enfants. So, thank you very much again for your hard work, for your support, and more importantly, for your support to our children, wherever they may live.
Minister, one of the issues that we've been struggling with all day has been the question of two questions. One of integration across sectors, because one of the areas that the Lancet report talks a lot about is that we've got health intervention, we've got education intervention, we've got social protection intervention. Very few countries have figured out exactly how it is that we should create delivery platforms that integrate across those sectors. And the second issue has been one of scale. We've got a lot of small projects, very few examples of national scale. Sitting where you sit now after a few months in office, do you have a view on these two things that might help direct our own thinking?
First, integration. Let me again allude to the challenge and the opportunity that a federation presents. The challenge, of course, is that when it comes to helping our children, most of the social services, the education services, the health services are provided by provinces and territories. So there is a view, which is fairly widely distributed, there is a view that the federal government should not attempt to enter the realm of childcare and early learning services, since by definition, the federal government will not be able to integrate those important services with the other dimensions that you discuss. However, there are, in a federation, mechanisms that involve data, research, outreach, openness, transparency, and accountability that can favor this type of integration by working intelligently around the emulation and the incentives that belonging to a federation with other provinces and territories can generate. And the federal government has this responsibility to put provinces and territories together in a respectful but effective manner to do the sort of things that the federal government can do better. So let me finish by saying that the role of the stakeholder community in Canada, and I use that word in a very broad manner, including the academic community, the private and the social sectors, the role of that community will be very important in the long term to support that collaboration between provinces and territories and the federal government in the context that you meant, to signal not only the value of investing in early learning and childcare, but the value of doing this in a broader context. Now, the second question, I forgot. Scale, that's right. Now, that's a very good question as well, because we are being told, and the criticism is all right, we're being told that we're starting from a relatively modest basis. $7 billion over 10 years might not be exactly what the needs and the expectations of Canadians are. And the answer to that is that we need to start from somewhere. And the resources matter initially. More importantly, as I just signaled, the mechanisms and the engagement processes also matter a great deal. So over time, we'll build over the initial investment, and we will also encourage, again, in a respectful manner, our colleagues from provinces and territories to follow our lead and invest intelligently in the welfare of our children.
Carly Silver.
Yeah. You can introduce yourself.
Oh,
Thank you. Hi, Carly Silver from Grand Challenges Canada. Thank you for your comments, Minister. I'm interested in your language around kind of skeptical Canadians that still need to be convinced. And this is largely a room that has been convinced, but I very much understand that we are in the minority still in Canada in terms of prioritizing children or seeing the role potentially of government in that. I'd just really love to hear from your experiences, and even moving these initial things through, what are the biggest kind of sources of that skepticism?
Yes, I think the skepticism is disappearing slowly, in large part due to organizations like this one, and the role, the patience in many cases of the stakeholder community over the last years and decades. But Canadians will always want reassurance that the investment of their resources, because they come from family, the tax dollars come from somewhere. So the investment of those resources is desirable not only from an economic perspective when it comes to helping parents earn income and work, but also from the aspect of developing children. I think it's on that aspect that there is a lot more work to do. Now, everyone understands that if parents need to go to work, now someone needs to look after the children. And everyone understands that this is a particular challenge for some types of families, single parents in particular, or lower wage parents as well. What is less understood, and that's why we have to work more strongly again, is why smart quality investments in early learning and childcare can make a difference not only in the child's welfare and well-being, but also current welfare and current well-being, but also for long-term considerations.
Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister, for your inspiring words. I'm Catherine Morton. I'm here with Aga Khan Foundation Canada. And you alluded to this in your first question, and then a little bit just now. But I'm wondering, when you talk about, it's important to get the data and the evidence to convince people that this is important. And so I'm wondering if you can speak at all about how the government will or could use academic institutions, researchers, professionals from these different aspects, health, education, social services, in order to gather that data and that evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. In last March budget, around the headlines, on the 7 billion headline and other things, there were two additional items that were probably less noted than I would have liked. The first one is the long-term investment in innovation strategies, 100 million over the next 10 years, for the federal government to encourage our communities to be testing new models of investing in early learning and childcare, again in a respectful but open manner with our partners from provinces and territories. The second thing is about the same amount, 100 million over 10 years, exactly for those purposes, for data, research, and outreach. And I'm very much open to your views on how we can do this, again, efficiently and inclusively. Now, this hasn't been, as I said, yet fully recognized in the context of all the other measures that the budget contained, but in the relatively short term, we'll be looking for ideas of how to use those resources most effectively for those three purposes: data, research, and outreach.
Minister, thank you very much. We're in your debt. Well, in a period of a very short set of remarks, Minister, you have, I think, captured so many of the issues that we have been exploring today. You talked about the multiple ways in which the early childhood agenda affects Canadians, the gender issues, poverty, the economic imperatives, the social development imperatives. You talked about the plight of Indigenous people. You've talked about the role of the Federation as proliferating best practices, or even good practices, across the country and indeed around the world. You've talked about the important role that policy can play in terms of providing support to families and parents, including the role of workplaces in the private sector in creating the environment for families and parents to invest in their children. And of course, you've ended by talking a lot about data, about research, about innovation, all big themes in our conversation today. So thank you, Minister, for taking the time to join us at the end of what has been a very, very rich discussion. Thank you, Minister. That does bring us to an end of our session today. On behalf of Aga Khan Foundation Canada, the Alliance for Human Development, I want to thank all of you for participating with such gusto and fortitude, if I might say, over the course of this afternoon's sessions. I want to particularly thank the members of the steering committee who have joined us today, Steve and Pia and Zulfi, for giving us such a cogent overview of the material in the report. Although I encourage everyone to still read the report, very important, along with our panelists later in the day giving us a range of ways in which we might take up some of these findings and translate them into real programs of activity in respective spheres of work. Thank you very much. I hope you'll join us for a bit of an informal opportunity to interact now. The Minister, I think, is going to be staying for at least a few minutes, so you'll have an opportunity to accost him individually with your hard questions, and no doubt he will be able to inquire to what you've taken away from today and ways in which might inform the work that he is now entrusted with on behalf of Canadians. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.